Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Shadow of the Arena, an unflinching chronicle of a Roman gladiator. Part 1, The Forging of a Weapon. Chapter 1, The World Before the Arena. The forest floor was a tapestry of damp earth and fallen leaves, the scent of pine and decaying wood thick in Kiso's nostrils. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew such places intimately, his caligy making little sound on the loamy path. Ahead, Marcus, the Decurion, grumbled about the chill in the late autumn air, his breath pluming white. Kiso, an auxiliary scout for the Legio IX Hispana, kept his observations to himself. The air wasn't just chill, it was still. Too still. The birdsong had muted an hour past, a subtle shift only a man attuned to the forest's rhythms would note. Kiso Vero. The name itself was a contradiction. Kiso, a traditional, somewhat archaic Roman praenomen, bestowed by a father who had served 25 years in the legions, earning his citizenship and a small plot of land in Gaul, near the territory of the Aedui. Vero, a common Roman cognomen. But his mother, she had been pure Gallic, a woman named Epona, her spirit as untamed as the wild horses she adored. She'd given him eyes the color of moss agate and a quiet understanding of the old ways, the whispers of the trees, the moods of the spirits his father dismissed as superstition. He was a man caught between two currents. He wore the Roman mail, carried the Roman gladius and pugio, spoke Latin with a soldier's clipped precision. He had tracked rebels for Rome, scouted treacherous mountain passes, and stood watch on frigid nights along the Rhine frontier. Yet, beneath the disciplined exterior, the Gallic blood ran strong, a persistent undercurrent of resentment for the eagle that had conquered his mother's people. His father, Titus Vero, had seen Rome as order, as civilization, as opportunity. His mother had seen it as a yoke. Kiso saw both. Anything, Vero? Marcus called back, his voice a harsh intrusion. Nothing, Decurion, Kiso replied, his tone neutral. The path is clear. Clear of men, perhaps. But not of intent. He felt it, a prickling on his skin, the same sensation he'd had just before the Nervii ambush years ago, a fight that had nearly cost him his life and earned him a commendation for valor. They were a small patrol, a manipulus of 30 men, ostensibly on a routine sweep for bandits. But tensions had been high in this region of Gaul for months. A new imperial tax, levied with typical Roman indifference to local hardship, had stoked simmering discontent. Whispers of defiance, of old chieftains stirring their clans, had reached the ears of legate Tiberius Claudius Drusus, a man whose ambition far outstripped his tactical acumen. Drusus, eager to make a name for himself, had ordered increased patrols, a show of force meant to intimidate. Kiso knew it was more likely to provoke. He remembered his father's words, spoken more in weariness than pride, after a particularly brutal campaign: Rome breaks what it can't rule, Kiso. Or it forces it to break itself. His mother had simply spat into the fire that night, her silence more eloquent than any curse. The path narrowed, winding through a dense thicket of ancient oaks. The silence now was absolute, oppressive. Kiso's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his gladius. He saw it then, a freshly broken twig on a branch too high for a deer, a faint scuff mark in the mud just off the path, angled inward. Signs only a trained eye, an eye that knew both Roman discipline and Gallic cunning, would register. Decurion, he began, his voice low, urgent. We should. The air exploded. A volley of javelins, crudely made but lethally aimed, hissed from the dense foliage. One thudded into the chest of the man beside Marcus with a sickening sound. Another pierced Marcus's shield arm, eliciting a roar of pain and fury. Then came the war cries, guttural and fierce, a language Kiso understood in his bones. Gauls. Not bandits, but warriors. Chaos erupted. Romans, caught by surprise in the narrow defile, struggled to form a defensive line. Kiso reacted on instinct honed by years of service. He drew his gladius, his shield coming up to cover his body. He saw a flash of brightly dyed tunic, a wild bearded face contorted in a snarl, an axe swinging for his head. He parried, the shock jarring his arm, and lunged, his blade finding flesh. The man gasped, eyes wide with shock, and fell. The fight was brutal, close quarters, a desperate struggle for survival. Kiso moved with deadly efficiency, a part of him, the Roman soldier, taking over. But another part, the Gallic son, felt a strange, cold detachment as he cut down men who could have been his kin. He saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also a desperate courage he recognized. It was over in minutes. The ambushers, outnumbered despite their initial advantage, broke and fled, melting back into the forest that was their ally. Of the 30 Romans, 12 lay dead or dying. Marcus, clutching his bleeding arm, was cursing vehemently. Kiso stood panting, his sword dripping. He felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. He had done his duty. He had survived. The survivors gathered, tending to the wounded, collecting the tags of the dead. Kiso, his training kicking in, began to scout the immediate area, looking for tracks, for any sign of the attackers' numbers or direction. He found a discarded shield, crudely painted with the emblem of a local tribe, the Arverni, a clan long thought pacified. When he returned, Legate Drusus himself had arrived, his face a mask of cold fury. He'd been with a larger column not far behind. He surveyed the carnage, his eyes lingering on Kiso. Drusus was a man who disliked complexities, and Kiso, with his mixed heritage and quiet demeanor, was a complexity. Vero, Drusus said, his voice like chipping flint. You were the scout. You saw nothing. The ambush was well laid, Legate, Kiso said, meeting the older man's gaze. They were hidden deep. I gave warning as soon as I confirmed signs. Confirmed signs? Drusus sneered. Or did your Gallic blood perhaps slow your tongue, hoping your kinsman would succeed? A cold dread settled in Kiso's stomach. He knew this tactic. Find a scapegoat. He was the perfect candidate, an auxiliary, not a true Roman citizen by birth, despite his father's service, a man with Gallic roots in a Gallic uprising. Legate, Kiso said, his voice steady, though his heart hammered. I have served Rome faithfully for 10 years. My loyalty is proven. Loyalty? Drusus's lip curled. It seems your loyalty allowed 12 Roman soldiers to die. Men say you hesitated, Vero. That you knew these woods, these people, too well. It was a lie, a poisonous fabrication, but Kiso saw the other officers around Drusus nodding slowly, their faces grim. No one would contradict a legate to defend a half-breed auxiliary. Marcus, his face pale from blood loss, avoided Kiso's gaze. The accusation came swiftly, formally. Kiso Vero, you are charged with dereliction of duty, collusion with the enemy, and treason against the Senate and people of Rome. The words were like hammer blows. Treason. He, who had bled for Rome, who had watched his Roman father swell with pride at his own enlistment. His mind reeled. He thought of his mother, her sorrowful eyes. He thought of his small, hard-won life, the respect he'd earned. All dissolving like mist. There was no trial, not really. Just a swift, brutal pronouncement before a makeshift military tribunal convened by Drusus. Witnesses, likely coerced or ambitious, spoke of his Gallic silences, his un-Roman familiarity with the enemy's terrain. His own testimony, his record of service, was dismissed. He was a convenient explanation for a military failure, a salve for Drusus's wounded pride and potentially damaged career. The sentence was read out in the cold, unforgiving light of the setting sun, the words echoing the finality of his fate, damnatio ad ludum. Condemnation to the games. Not a swift execution, but a slow, public death for the entertainment of the masses. A gladiator. He felt a profound numbness. A disbelief so vast it crowded out fear. His weapons were stripped from him, his armor unbuckled by rough hands. He was no longer Quiso Vero, auxiliary scout of the Legio IX Hispana. He was nothing. Less than nothing. He was res, a thing, a piece of property destined for the arena. As iron shackles were clamped onto his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin, he looked out at the darkening forest, the woods that had been his sanctuary and his hunting ground. He saw his father's disappointed face, his mother's grieving one. The world he knew, the identity he had carefully constructed between two warring halves of his soul, had been shattered. What was lost? Everything. His freedom, his name, his honor, his past, his future. All sacrificed on the altar of Roman ambition and expediency. The quiet resentment he had harbored for Rome now blazed into a cold, hard ember of hatred. But beneath it, a deeper, more terrifying feeling began to stir, the chilling realization that his life, his very humanity, was no longer his own. It belonged to the sand, to the crowd, to the spectacle of death. The world before the arena had been a complex dance of loyalty and heritage, of duty and quiet defiance. Now, that world was gone, leaving only the stark, brutal reality of the chains that bound him. Chapter 2, Chains of Fate. The pronouncement of damnatio ad ludum was not the end, but the beginning of a new, horrifying chapter. The numbness that had enveloped Quiso receded, replaced by a seething, helpless rage, quickly followed by the cold grip of despair. His Roman mail, once a symbol of his service, felt like a suffocating weight as it was roughly torn from him. His gladius and pugio, extensions of his own arm for a decade, were cast aside like common scrap. He was stripped down to his tunic, the chill air raising gooseflesh on his skin, a stark reminder of his sudden vulnerability. Then came the brand. He was shoved forward, his arms wrenched behind his back. The smell of burning flesh, acrid and sickening, filled the air from a nearby brazier. He saw the glowing iron, a simple L for ludus, and knew this mark would sear deeper than his skin. It was a brand of ownership, a permanent declaration that he was no longer a man, but property. He clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out as the hot metal pressed into the flesh of his left shoulder. The pain was a blinding white sheet, but the humiliation burned hotter, etching itself onto his soul. He was marked, a beast for slaughter. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, the chains clinking with every movement, Quiso was thrown in with a motley collection of other condemned men. Some were captured rebels, their faces still raw with defiance or blank with shock. Others were hardened criminals, their eyes darting, assessing. A few wept openly, broken figures already defeated by their fate. They were a column of the damned, destined for the gladiatorial schools of Capua, the notorious heartland of the bloody games. The journey south was a brutal education in human misery. They marched under the watchful eyes of grim-faced legionaries, a detachment specifically assigned to transport human cargo. Days bled into a monotonous cycle of forced marches, meager rations of stale bread and watered-down wine, and nights spent huddled together for warmth in makeshift enclosures, the stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and excrement a constant companion. The guards were indifferent to their suffering, their prods and curses a reminder of their absolute power. Quiso, trained to endure hardship, fell back on the discipline ingrained by years in the legions. He observed, he conserved his energy, he husbanded his anger, letting it cool into a hard, dense core within him. He watched as the weaker men succumbed. One, a young Gaul scarcely more than a boy, caught a fever and was left by the roadside, his pleas for mercy ignored. Another, a hulking Germanic warrior who had roared defiance at their captors, fell into a sullen silence, his spirit visibly eroding with each passing mile until one morning he simply refused to rise, his eyes vacant. He was beaten, then dragged until he became an unmanageable burden and was dispatched with a casual sword thrust. His body, like the young Gaul's, was left unburied. The lesson was clear: survival was a grim calculus of endurance and a willingness to witness, and perhaps eventually participate in, the degradation of others. It was during the third week of this agonizing trek, as the landscape began to shift from the dense forests of northern Gaul to the rolling hills and vineyards of the south, that Kiso found himself chained beside two men who, in their own ways, offered a flicker of something other than despair. The first was a wiry, quick-eyed man with a network of faded scars on his arms and a cynical twist to his lips. He introduced himself, in a low whisper during a brief halt, as Vibius. Ex-thief, ex-gambler, ex-everything but stupid, he'd said, his voice raspy. Though ending up here does cast some doubt on that last claim. Despite the grim circumstances, Vibius possessed a gallows humor that seemed to keep the deepest despair at bay. He had an uncanny ability to scrounge an extra morsel of food or find the driest spot to sleep, his movements fluid and economical even in chains. "And you, soldier boy?" Vibius had asked, nodding at Kiso's bearing, which still held the ghost of military discipline. "Bad luck? Or just bad at whatever it was you were supposed to be doing?" Falsely accused, Kiso stated, the words tasting like ash. Vibius snorted, a dry, rasping sound. "Aren't we all, in one way or another? The gods must have a laugh, watching us scurry about, thinking we're in charge of our own destinies." Then, snap. He made a gesture with his chained hands. "The thread breaks, and here we are, marching to our deaths for the amusement of fat men in togas." The other man was a stark contrast. Tall and powerfully built, with skin the color of polished ebony, he moved with a proud, unbroken dignity that seemed to defy the chains. His name was Felix, and his Latin was accented, spoken with a deep resonance. He had been a warrior in his homeland, a Nubian kingdom far to the south, captured in a border skirmish by Roman slave traders and sold into the brutal machinery of the empire. He rarely spoke, but his eyes, dark and intense, missed nothing. He met the guards' contempt with a silent, unwavering stare that seemed to discomfit them more than any outburst. One evening, as they huddled against a biting wind, Vibius was trying to coax a story from Felix. "Come on, giant. What were you before all this? A king? A god in a loincloth?" Felix finally looked at him, a flicker of something, amusement, sorrow, in his eyes. "I was a hunter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Of lions. And men who threatened my people." "Lions, eh?" Vibius whistled. "Well, you'll find plenty of beasts where we're going. Two-legged ones, mostly, and a damn sight uglier." Kiso, listening, felt a strange kinship with Felix. Both were warriors, both torn from their lands and their identities, both facing a future dictated by Roman cruelty. Felix's quiet strength was a counterpoint to Vibius's restless energy. The journey wore on. The sun beat down, then the rains came, turning the roads into quagmires. Men developed sores from the chafing chains, their feet bled, their spirits frayed. Some fought amongst themselves over scraps of food or perceived slights, their desperation turning them feral. Kiso witnessed these displays with a grim detachment, intervening only when absolutely necessary, usually when the guard's attention was drawn, threatening collective punishment. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the guards' moods, the cadence of their footsteps, the signs of an impending beating. He saw the Roman world from the underside now. The grand roads, marvels of engineering, were pathways of suffering. The fertile fields, testament to Rome's bounty, were cultivated by the sweat of slaves. The towns they passed through, with their imposing stone buildings and bustling marketplaces, were filled with citizens who averted their eyes from the prisoner column, or worse, jeered and threw refuse, their faces alight with a cruel curiosity. For Kiso, the Romanized Gaul, the man who had once felt a grudging respect for the empire's order, this journey was a brutal dismantling of any lingering illusions. Rome was not just law and legion, it was a vast, insatiable maw, consuming lives and cultures, spitting out broken men for its amusement. As they neared Capua, the air itself seemed to change. It grew heavier, tinged with a faint, metallic scent that Kiso couldn't quite place, but which stirred a primal unease within him. The guards became more vigilant, their talk more coarse, filled with anticipation of delivering their cargo and collecting their pay. One evening, huddled with Vibius and Felix, Kiso watched the distant glow of a large settlement against the twilight sky. Capua, Vibius muttered, gnawing on a piece of dried meat he'd somehow procured. The butcher's block of Italy. They say the sand there is permanently stained red. Felix stared towards the glow, his expression unreadable. Then we will make it redder still, he said softly, not as a boast, but as a statement of grim intent. Kiso said nothing. He felt the brand on his shoulder throb, a constant reminder. The chains had become a familiar weight, a part of him. The journey had stripped away much, his pride, his hope, his name. But within the crucible of shared suffering, something new and unwelcome was being forged, a gladiator. The path ahead led into the heart of that bloody profession, into the shadow of the arena. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the man who had been Kiso Vero, auxiliary scout, was dying with every step. Chapter 3, Welcome to the Ludus. The gates of Capua loomed. Massive and imposing, like the jaws of some mythical beast ready to devour them. The city hummed with a chaotic energy, a stark contrast to the somber silence of their long march. The streets were crowded, noisy, a vibrant tapestry of merchants hawking wares, citizens bustling about their business, and the ever-present sight of soldiers and city guards. But even amidst this urban clamor, the prisoner column drew stares, a mixture of morbid curiosity, contempt, and for some, a flicker of pity quickly suppressed. They were not paraded through the main thoroughfares, but shunted through narrower, dirtier back alleys, the stench of refuse and unwashed humanity growing stronger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of navigating the labyrinthine city, they stopped before a high, windowless stone wall, topped with wicked-looking iron spikes. A heavy wooden gate, reinforced with iron bands, was set into the wall. Above it, crudely carved into a weathered stone lintel, was a wolf's head, snarling, teeth bared. Ludus Calvus. The gate creaked open with agonizing slowness, revealing a wide, dusty courtyard. And with that opening came a wave of smells that hit Kiso like a physical blow, the overpowering odor of stale sweat, old blood, fear, cheap wine, and something acrid and metallic that he now recognized, the scent of the arena itself, clinging to everything like a shroud. The sounds were equally jarring, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, the grunts and shouts of men training, the sharp crack of a whip, and underlying it all, a low murmur of voices, some defiant, some despairing, some simply resigned. This was it. The gladiatorial school. Their new home. Their prison. Their abattoir. Rough hands shoved them forward into the courtyard. The gate slammed shut behind them with a sound of chilling finality. They were lined up, a ragged collection of broken men, blinking in the harsh sunlight that seemed to trap itself within the high walls. Around them, other men, stripped to the waist, their bodies scarred and gleaming with sweat, paused in their brutal exercises to stare. Their eyes were hard, appraising, devoid of sympathy. These were the veterani, the survivors, the ones who had learned to thrive, or at least endure, in this merciless environment. A figure emerged from a doorway leading into a low, long building that seemed to be the main barracks. He was a short, powerfully built man, his bald head gleaming with sweat, his gut protruding slightly over a stained leather apron. His eyes, small and black like polished obsidian, swept over the new arrivals with an unervingly shrewd gaze. This, Kiso surmised, was the lanista. More fresh meat for the grinder, Titus, the man said, his voice surprisingly reedy for his build. He addressed one of their guards, who offered a curt nod and a scroll. 30 head, Gnaeus Calvus, the guard replied. As per the contract. Some Gallic rebels, few criminals, one special case. The guard gestured vaguely towards Kiso. Gnaeus Calvus grunted, taking the scroll. His eyes flickered over the names, then landed on Kiso, lingering for a moment. Kiso met his gaze, holding it steady, refusing to show the apprehension that churned within him. Calvus's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that held no warmth. A Roman auxiliary, they say, Calvus mused, tapping the scroll. Betrayed his own. Or so the official story goes. He walked slowly down the line of new arrivals, his eyes missing nothing, the fear in one man's eyes, the simmering defiance in another's, the physical condition of each. He was a merchant assessing livestock, and they were the goods. "Look at them," Calvus said, more to himself than to anyone in particular, though his voice carried across the courtyard. "Scared. Weak. Useless. But we'll fix that, won't we?" He stopped before Felix, whose proud bearing seemed to irritate him. "You Nubian. Think you're still a king?" He prodded Felix's chest with a thick finger. Felix remained impassive, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Calvus's head. Calvus grunted again, moving on. He paused in front of Vibius, who, despite the circumstances, offered a weak, ingratiating smile. "And you, rat face? What's your talent?" "Stealing the soap." "A man of many hidden talents, Lanista," Vibius quipped, his voice raspy. "You'll be surprised." Calvus actually chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I doubt it. But surprises are sometimes profitable." Finally, he stood before Kiso. He circled him slowly, like a wolf inspecting a potential rival. "Kiso Vero," Calvus read from the scroll. "Desertion and treason. A heavy sentence for an auxiliary. You must have potential." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of sour wine and garlic. "Or you made a powerful enemy. Either way, your past is ashes. Here, you are what I say you are. Understand?" Kiso inclined his head slightly. "I understand." "Good." Calvus stepped back. "Here at Ludus Calvus, we have a simple philosophy. You fight, you obey, you survive. You fail at any of those, and you become dog meat. Or worse, you disappoint me." His smile widened, revealing stained teeth. "And you don't want to disappoint me." He clapped his hands sharply. "Doctors. Get this rabble processed. Strip them, clean them, they stink worse than the damn sewers, and get them assigned. I want to see what we've bought by nightfall." Two new figures emerged, men who moved with a different kind of authority. They were older, heavily scarred, their bodies thick with the muscle of long, hard training. Their eyes held a weary, brutal knowledge. These were the doctors, the trainers, former gladiators themselves who had survived long enough to earn a grim sort of retirement teaching others the art of killing and dying. The new arrivals were herded towards a trough of cold water and issued with rough scrubbing brushes and harsh lye soap. The experience was degrading, public, but Kiso scrubbed himself with a grim determination, washing away the filth of the journey, trying to wash away the brand of defeat. He saw Vibius shivering but resolute, Felix enduring the humiliation with stoic silence. They were given coarse linen tunics, rougher even than their prisoner garb, and assigned to a dark, crowded section of the barracks. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and despair. Wooden bunks, little more than shelves, lined the walls in triple tiers. There was no privacy, no personal space. The hierarchy of the damned was already evident. Older, more established gladiators occupied the lower, more desirable bunks, their few meager possessions, a worn blanket, a carved token, guarded jealously. The newcomers were relegated to the highest, most cramped spots, or simply the bare floor. Kiso found a space on an upper bunk, the wood rough beneath him. He lay there for a moment, the sounds of the ludus pressing in, the clang of steel, the shouts, the groans. He closed his eyes, but there was no escape. The image of Gnaeus Calvus's predatory smile, the weight of the Lanista's ownership, was seared into his mind. This was not just a place of training, it was a place designed to break a man's spirit, to strip him of his identity and remold him into a weapon, a spectacle. The despair was a palpable entity in the room, a heavy cloak threatening to suffocate him. He saw it in the vacant eyes of some of the other new arrivals, the men who were already succumbing. Vibius, ever resourceful, had managed to find a relatively clean corner on the floor. He caught Kiso's eye and gave a grim little shrug, as if to say, well, here we are. Felix had found a spot near a small, barred window, staring out at the sliver of sky visible through the grime, his back straight, his silence a fortress. The despair was a tangible thing, a living entity in the ludus calvus. But Kiso felt that hard ember of anger within him stir. They could take his freedom, his name, his past. They could brand him and chain him. But he would not let them take his will. He would learn. He would adapt. He would survive. The alternative was unthinkable. As dusk began to settle, casting long, ominous shadows across the courtyard, a horn blew, a mournful sound that echoed off the stone walls. It was the signal for the evening meal. The forging had truly begun. Welcome to the ludus. Welcome to hell. Chapter 4, The Lannista's Shadow. The evening meal was a grim affair. A thin, lukewarm gruel of barley and beans, served in chipped wooden bowls, eaten standing in the crowded, noisy mess hall. It was sustenance, nothing more, consumed quickly under the watchful eyes of guards and senior gladiators. Kiso ate mechanically, his senses still reeling from the day's assaults. The food was bland, but it was fuel. He would need it. After the meal, the new arrivals, still dazed and disoriented, were summoned back to the main courtyard. The Lanista, Gnaeus Calvus, stood on a slightly raised wooden platform, flanked by his two chief doctors. The fading light cast his squat, powerful figure in stark relief, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the dusty ground, an apt metaphor for his influence over every life within these walls. Listen well, you worms. Calvus's reedy voice cut through the murmurs of the assembled gladiators, new and old. You are here because the world outside has deemed you worthless. Criminals, rebels, debtors, traitors. His eyes, small and sharp, scanned their faces. Here, you have a chance to earn a different kind of worth. The worth of a fighter. The worth of a spectacle. The worth of the roar of the crowd. He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtyard was silent save for the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a workshop wing. I am Gnaeus Calvus, he continued, thumping his chest with a meaty fist. This is my ludus. My family. And like any good paterfamilias, I expect obedience. I expect effort. I expect results. His gaze hardened. I have invested good coin in each of you, even the scrawniest. Don't make me regret my investment. He gestured to one of the doctors, a formidable man with a scarred face and a missing ear, whose name Kiso would later learn was Pallas. This is Pallas, my Doctor Primus. He fought as a Murmillo for 15 years. He has killed more men than you've had hot dinners. His word is my word. Disobey him, and you answer to me. Pallas stepped forward, his eyes like chips of ice. He said nothing, merely surveyed the new recruits with an expression of profound disdain that was more intimidating than any threat. And this, Calvus indicated the other doctor, a leaner, wirier man with restless energy, is Crixus. A retiarius in his day, quick as a viper. He will teach you how to move, how to deceive, how to turn your enemy's strength against him. Crixus offered a predatory grin, his teeth startlingly white against his sun-darkened skin. Your lives here will be hard, Calvus went on, his voice taking on a confiding, almost fatherly tone that was deeply unsettling. The training will break you. The discipline will chafe. But it is for your own good. We are forging weapons here. And a weapon must be strong, sharp, and utterly reliable. He then laid out the brutal realities of their existence. Their days would be filled with relentless training, from dawn till dusk. Their food would be basic but sufficient to build strength. Their medical care, provided by the ludus medicus, would be enough to patch them up for the next fight, but no more. Any infraction of the rules, insubordination, laziness, fighting outside the training circle, would be met with swift and brutal punishment. The whip, the stocks, solitary confinement on starvation rations, these were the tools of his authority. Some of you will die in training, Calvus stated, his voice devoid of emotion. It is regrettable, but it weeds out the weak. Those who survive, those who learn, those who show promise, they will see the arena. They will taste the cheers of the crowd. They might even earn their fame. He smiled, a wolfish baring of teeth. And fame, my worthless worms, can be a valuable commodity. He then spoke of the ultimate prize, the one whispered about in hushed, desperate tones, the rudis. The wooden sword, symbol of freedom, awarded to a gladiator who had served with exceptional skill and longevity. The rudis, Calvus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. It is not a myth. I have granted it. To those who earn it. To those who become legends. To those who make me very, very wealthy. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Serve me well, fight well, bleed well for the mob, and perhaps, just perhaps, one of you might one day hold that symbol of freedom. Kiso watched him, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Calvus was a master manipulator, dangling the faintest glimmer of hope amidst a sea of despair. He understood the power of that distant dream, how it could drive men to endure unimaginable horrors. He was also acutely aware of the Lanista's true motivation, profit. Every word, every gesture, was calculated to extract the maximum value from his human chattel. Gladiators were investments, and Calvus was a shrewd, ruthless businessman. He saw how Calvus played favorites, even in this initial address. He lingered on a massive German, Regenhaar, whose sheer brute strength was obvious. You, barbarian, Calvus had said, you have the look of a killer. We will hone that. To Felix, he offered a backhanded compliment about his physique, implying he would be a crowd pleaser. And to Kiso, he gave a particular look, a assessing glint in his eye. The soldier, Calvus said, his voice carrying. Roman discipline can be a valuable asset in the arena. Or a fatal flaw if you cannot adapt. We shall see, Vero. We shall see if your supposed treason taught you anything about survival. The Lanista's shadow fell heavily over them all, but Kiso felt it as a particular weight. Calvus saw something in him, perhaps his past military training, perhaps the quiet intensity in his eyes. Whatever it was, Calvus had marked him, not just with the brand of the ludus, but with his personal attention. This could be an advantage, a chance to gain notice, to perhaps navigate the treacherous currents of the ludus more effectively. Or it could be a curse, making him a target, a pawn in Calvus's games. As Calvus finished his speech, dismissing them with a wave of his hand, the veteran gladiators began to disperse, their conversations low and guarded. The new recruits stood uncertainly, the Lanista's words echoing in the oppressive atmosphere. Vibius sidled up to Kiso, his usual cynical humor tinged with a new layer of apprehension. Well, that was uplifting, he muttered. Makes you want to go out and die gloriously for his profit margins, doesn't it? He owns us, Kiso said, his voice flat. Body and soul. That was the message. And don't you forget it, came a new voice, rough and deep. It was one of the veteran gladiators, a man with a heavily scarred face and one eye milky white. He'd overheard them. Calvus is a snake. He'll smile at you one moment, sell you to the beasts the next if the price is right. Only thing he cares about is coin. The veteran spat on the ground. Remember that, new blood. Your life is worth what he can get for it. Nothing more. He then turned and walked away, disappearing into the deepening gloom of the barracks. The Lanista's shadow was indeed absolute. It dictated their waking hours, their meager comforts, their brutal training, and ultimately, their chances of survival. Gnaeus Calvus was not just their owner, he was their god, their tormentor, and the arbiter of their fates. He held the power of life and death, the power to elevate a man to fleeting glory or condemn him to a nameless grave in the sand. And Kiso knew, with a chilling certainty, that navigating the treacherous currents of Calvus's ambition and greed would be as crucial to his survival as any skill he learned with a sword. The fight for his life had begun, not just against other gladiators, but against the pervasive, all-encompassing shadow of the man who owned him. Chapter 5, The Doctor's Gaze. The first full day in the ludus calvus began before dawn, with the harsh clang of an iron bar against a hanging shield. Sleep, already fitful and plagued by nightmares, was violently banished. Groans and curses echoed through the crowded barracks as men stumbled from their hard bunks, the air thick with the familiar morning stench of unwashed bodies and stale fear. After another meager meal, this time, a thin porridge that did little to quell the gnawing hunger, the new recruits were herded into a separate training yard, smaller and more desolate than the main one. Here, under the cold, appraising gaze of Dr. Pallas, their true education was to begin. Pallas was a formidable figure. Taller than Calvus, his body was a roadmap of past battles. A jagged scar traced a white line from his temple down his cheek, another puckered the flesh of his thick forearm, and his left ear was a mangled nub. He moved with a surprising grace for a man his size, a remnant of the Murmillo he once was, a heavily armed gladiator who relied on strength and relentless aggression. His eyes, though, were what held Kiso's attention. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and distant, yet they missed nothing. They held the weary wisdom of a man who had stared into the abyss of the arena countless times and survived, but at a cost. He carried a rudis, the wooden training sword, but it looked less like a symbol of past freedom and more like an instrument of discipline in his calloused hand. He paced before the nervous line of recruits, his silence more unnerving than any shouted threat. "You are nothing," Pallas finally said, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together. It was not a statement of contempt, Kiso thought, but a statement of fact. "Less than nothing. You are raw clay, soft and formless. My task," he tapped his chest with the rudis, "is to see if any of you can be molded into something useful. Something that might survive its first encounter with sharpened steel." His gaze swept over them, lingering on each man for a moment, a silent, brutal assessment. Kiso felt that gaze pass over him, and it was like being weighed and measured, not just physically, but for some deeper, intangible quality. "Forget who you were," Pallas continued. "Your names, your families, your past glories or your past crimes, they are dust. Here, you are recruits. Tyrones. And most Tyrones die. Quickly. Painfully." He let that sink in. "My job is not to make you comfortable. My job is to make you hard. To teach you to endure pain. To teach you to kill before you are killed." He began with the basics, the absolute fundamentals of stance, balance, and movement. His methods were relentless, unforgiving. He demonstrated a simple defensive posture, shield arm forward, body angled, then forced them to hold it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Muscles screamed, sweat poured. Any man who faltered, whose shield dipped, whose stance wavered, received a sharp crack of the rudis across the shins or ribs. The blows were not intended to maim, not yet, but to inflict sharp, immediate pain, a brutal reinforcement of the lesson. "Your shield is your life." Pallas barked, striking a recruit whose shield had drooped. The man yelped, stumbling. "Treat it with respect, or the sand will drink your blood." Kiso, drawing on his years of legionary training, found the basic drills familiar, though the emphasis was different. In the legions, discipline was about formation, cohesion, the strength of the unit. Here, it was about individual survival, about turning the body into a self-contained killing machine. He focused, his mind shutting out the discomfort, the fear, the resentment. He moved as instructed, his body remembering old patterns, adapting them to this new, grimmer purpose. Pallas noticed. Kiso saw the flicker of something in the doctor's cold eyes as he observed Kiso's efficient movements, his unwavering stance. It wasn't approval, not yet, but a grudging acknowledgement. Throughout the morning, Pallas drilled them relentlessly. Footwork, basic strikes with the wooden training swords, defensive blocks. He moved among them, correcting, criticizing, his rudis a constant threat. He was not pointlessly cruel, Kiso observed, but brutally efficient. Every blow, Every harsh word had a purpose: to strip away weakness, to instill instinct, to forge reflexes that might mean the difference between life and death. He showed them the weight of a real gladius, letting them feel its balance, its deadly potential. "This is not a toy," he said, his voice low. "This is an extension of your will. It has one purpose: to find your enemy's life." There was a quiet desperation to Pallas's instruction, Kiso realized. This man had been where they were going. He had felt the roar of the crowd, the terror of the fight, the sting of wounds. Perhaps, beneath the hardened exterior, there was a sliver of something akin to empathy, or at least a grim understanding of the fate that awaited most of them. He wasn't just training them to be gladiators, he was training them to die well, if die they must. During a brief respite, as the recruits gasped for air and drank sparingly from a water bucket, Pallas approached Kiso. "Vero, is it?" Pallas said, his voice softer now, without the barking cadence he used for the group. "Yes, Doctor." Pallas tapped Kiso's shoulder, the one that still bore the faint ache of the legionary's brand, now overlaid by the fresher, sharper pain of the ludus mark. "You've held a sword before. Seen battle." It wasn't a question. 10 years with the 9th, Kiso replied. Pallas nodded slowly. "The Legion teaches discipline. That is good. But the arena is not the battlefield. There are no comrades to cover your flank. No formations to protect you. Out there," he gestured vaguely towards the unseen Colosseum, "you are alone. Your life is worth the roar of a crowd. No more. Remember that." His gaze was intense, probing. "Legionary tactics can get you killed here. Too rigid. Too predictable. You need to learn to be a wolf, not just a soldier in a line." Kiso met his gaze. "I will learn, Doctor." A ghost of a smile touched Pallas's lips, so fleeting Kiso almost missed it. "Perhaps you will. Most don't. They cling to what they know, or they break. We shall see." He turned and walked away, his scarred back a testament to his own hard-won survival. Later that day, Dr. Crixus, the retiarius, took over. His style was entirely different. Where Pallas was about power and rooted defense, Crixus was about speed, agility, and deception. He taught them evasive maneuvers, feints, how to use their environment. He was a whirlwind of motion, his training net flicking out with astonishing speed and accuracy, entangling clumsy recruits, tripping them, disarming them. His laughter was sharp and mocking, but there was a keen intelligence in his eyes. "The arena is a stage," Crixus declared, darting around them. "You are actors in a play of death. The crowd wants a show. Give them a show. Be cunning. Be quick. Be unpredictable. A slow target is a dead target." The contrast between the two doctors was stark, yet complementary. Pallas forged the iron, Crixus sharpened the edge. Both were essential for survival. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the training yard, the recruits were exhausted, bruised, and demoralized. Several had already washed out, collapsing from exhaustion or breaking down in tears of frustration and pain, only to be dragged away by guards, their fate uncertain but undoubtedly grim. Kiso's muscles ached, his hands were raw from gripping the wooden sword, and a fresh collection of bruises was forming. But he was still standing. He had listened. He had watched. He had endured. That evening, as he lay on his hard bunk, the words of Pallas echoed in his mind, "Out there, your life is worth the roar of a crowd. No more." It was a brutal truth, but a necessary one. The doctor's gaze, cold and unflinching, had stripped away any lingering illusions of romance or glory associated with the gladiator. This was a grim business, a profession of controlled violence and inevitable death. Pallas himself was a product of that system, a survivor scarred in body and, undoubtedly, in spirit. He was a living embodiment of the life Kiso was now condemned to. Pallas had seen something in Kiso, a flicker of potential. But he had also issued a warning. The arena demanded more than just skill, it demanded a transformation. The doctor's gaze was a constant reminder of that brutal imperative, adapt or die. And Kiso, clinging to that hard ember of will within him, knew he had no other choice. He would learn from Pallas, from Crixus, from every brutal lesson the Ludus had to offer. He would become what they wanted him to be, but he would do it on his own terms, if such a thing was even possible in the shadow of the arena. Chapter 6, Breaking the Body, Forging the Fighter. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of brutal, relentless exertion. Dawn brought the clanging summons, the hurried, inadequate meal, and then the training yards. The sun beat down mercilessly. Or the rains turned the packed earth into a slick, treacherous mire. It made no difference to the doctors. The training continued. Pallas focused on raw physical conditioning, pushing their bodies to, and often beyond, their perceived limits. They ran endless circuits of the courtyard, their lungs burning, their legs screaming in protest. They lifted heavy stones, their muscles straining and tearing, only to be rebuilt stronger. They engaged in grueling wrestling matches, the rough sand abrading their skin, every fall a jarring impact. Pallas was a relentless taskmaster, his voice a constant goad, his rudest quick to punish any sign of weakness or flagging effort. Pain is a messenger, he would roar as a recruit crumpled, gasping for breath. It tells you you are alive. It tells you where you are weak. Listen to it. Conquer it. Or it will conquer you in the arena. Kiso, despite his years of legionary conditioning, found himself pushed to new extremes. The legion built endurance for the march, strength for carrying equipment and holding a line. The Ludus demanded explosive power, blinding speed, and an almost animalistic resilience. His hands, accustomed to the grip of a gladius, blistered and bled from the constant friction of the wooden training weapons, the rough ropes used for climbing, and the unyielding stone weights. His shoulders ached from shield drills, his back from endless lifting and throwing. Every muscle group screamed in protest. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow, exhausted stupor, offering little respite. He would often jolt awake, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of a blow or the echo of Pallas's voice still ringing in his ears. The barracks were filled with the sounds of men groaning in their sleep, coughing, or whimpering from their injuries. It was a symphony of suffering. Yet, Kiso endured. He focused on the task at hand, drawing on a deep well of discipline and sheer stubbornness. He learned to pace himself, to push through the pain barrier, to find that place within where the mind could command the body even when the body begged for surrender. He watched the other recruits. Some, like the hulking German, Regan Haar, seemed to thrive on the raw physicality, their brute strength carrying them through. Others, more slightly built, struggled, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and grim determination. And some broke. One morning, during a particularly brutal session of sparring with weighted clubs, a young Thracian boy, barely old enough to shave, simply dropped his club and fell to his knees, sobbing. He couldn't take any more. Pallas stared at him, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then, without a word, he gestured to two guards. The boy was dragged away, his cries fading into the indifferent noise of the Ludus. He was never seen again. The lesson was stark, unspoken but understood by all. Failure was not an option. The Ludus had no place for the weak, the broken, or the unwilling. It was a crucible designed to forge fighters, and those who could not withstand the heat were simply discarded. The incident had a chilling effect on the remaining recruits. The fear of that same fate drove them harder, pushing them to find reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Kiso saw it in Vibius's eyes, a new, harder glint beneath the usual cynicism. Even Vibius, with his penchant for shirking and cutting corners, was applying himself with a desperate intensity. Felix, as always, met the brutality with a quiet, stoic resolve, his movements powerful and economical, his endurance seemingly limitless. Dr. Crixus, in his sessions, focused on agility and weapon-specific techniques. He introduced them to the various tools of their trade, the trident and net of the retiarius, the short sword and heavy shield of the murmillo, the curved sicca of the thrax. He demonstrated the deadly dance of each style, the feints, the parries, the killing blows. His own movements were a blur, his training net a living thing in his hands. The arena is small. Crixus would shout, his voice sharp. No room for error. Know your weapon. Know your opponent's weapon. Exploit his weakness before he finds yours. He paired them off for mock combat. The rudes clattering, the air filled with grunts and shouts. These were not gentle exercises. Blows landed hard, even with blunted wood. Tempers flared. The ever-present threat of serious injury, even in training, hung in the air. Crixus encouraged aggression, a controlled fury. Feel the blood sing, he'd cry. Let the wolf out. But keep the leash tight. Anger is a weapon, but only if you control it. Kiso found himself drawn to the secutor style. The heavy, enveloping helmet, the large rectangular shield, scutum, the straight-bladed gladius, it felt familiar, an echo of his legionary past. But it was more than familiarity. The secutor was typically pitted against the retiarius, a classic pairing of heavy armor and relentless pursuit versus agility and ranged weaponry. There was a strategy to it, a grim game of cat and mouse that appealed to Kiso's calculating mind. His body, slowly, painstakingly, began to adapt. The blisters on his hands calloused over. The aching muscles grew harder, more defined. His reflexes sharpened. He learned to anticipate Pallas's drills, Crixus's feints. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer an enemy. It was a signal, a teacher. He was learning its language. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Kiso sat on the edge of his bunk, tending to a fresh set of bruises on his ribs where Regenhar, during a sparring match, had landed a particularly vicious blow. The German fought with a wild, untamed ferocity, relying on brute strength and intimidation. Vibius, nursing a swollen lip, slumped down beside him. "Gods, my everything aches," he groaned. "I think Pallas is trying to kill us before Calvus even gets a chance to sell us." "He's trying to keep us alive," Kiso said, wincing as he applied a rag soaked in cold water to his side. Vibius looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You almost sound like you believe that, soldier boy." "If we're weak, we die in the first fight," Kiso stated simply. "Pallas knows that. Crixus knows that. They've lived it." Felix, who had been silently stretching nearby, nodded in agreement. "They break the body," he said, his voice a low rumble, "to see if the spirit is strong enough to be forged." Kiso looked at his own hands, no longer the hands of a scout or a legionary. They were becoming the hands of a gladiator, calloused, scarred, capable of inflicting death. The transformation was undeniable, etched into his very flesh. His body was being broken, yes, but from that breaking, something new, something harder and more resilient, was emerging. He was being forged, piece by painful piece, into a weapon. The physical toll was immense, the exhaustion bone deep. But with it came a grim sense of accomplishment. He was surviving. He was learning. He was adapting. The despair that had threatened to consume him in those first days was receding, replaced by a cold, hard focus. The fight to remain human was becoming intertwined with the fight to become a fighter. For in the ludus calvus, to be anything less than a perfectly honed instrument of death was to be nothing at all. And Kiso, despite everything he had lost, was not yet ready to be nothing. Chapter 7, The Rudiments of Death, First Weapons, First Scars. Weeks bled into months under the relentless regimen of the ludus calvus. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim acceptance of their new reality. The brutal conditioning continued, but now, alongside the endless drills and physical torment, came the true rudiments of their deadly profession, weapons training with blunted, but still dangerous, steel. Dr. Pallas, his face an unreadable mask, supervised the transition. "Wood teaches you form," he announced one morning, his voice carrying over the assembled recruits. "Steel teaches you respect. For your weapon. For your opponent. And for death." They were issued with practice versions of the actual arena weaponry, weighted gladius replicas, blunted tridents, dulled psyche. Even without a sharpened edge, the impact of steel on a wooden shield, or worse, on unprotected flesh, was a jarring, painful education. The clang of metal became the dominant soundtrack of their days, a constant reminder of the lethal purpose for which they were being shaped. Kiso, having chosen the path of the secutor, was given a heavy practice scutum and a blunted gladius. The weight was familiar, comforting in a strange way, a tangible link to his past life as a soldier. But the application was different. Legionary fighting was about formations, disciplined advances, and mutual support. Gladiator combat was a solitary, brutal dance, a series of one-on-one duels where any mistake could be fatal. Pallas drilled them in the specific techniques of their chosen styles. For Kiso, this meant learning to use the large scutum not just for defense, but as an offensive weapon, to bash and unbalance an opponent. He learned the precise footwork required to maintain pressure on a nimbler foe like a retiarius, to cut off escape routes, and to deliver powerful, targeted thrusts with the gladius to the vulnerable points not covered by armor. "The secutor is a hunter," Pallas instructed, his rudis tapping Kiso's shield. "Relentless. Unyielding. You wear down your prey. You give him no quarter. Your helmet limits your vision, your hearing. You must compensate. Feel your opponent. Anticipate his moves." The first sparring sessions with blunted steel were chaotic and clumsy. Fear made men hesitant, or overly aggressive. The sound of metal striking metal, even dulled, was a visceral shock. Blows that would have been glancing with wood now carried significant force. Bruising ribs, jarring teeth, and occasionally drawing blood from split lips or scraped knuckles. Kiso's first real taste of this came against a nervous, wary recruit attempting the retiarius style. The man, fumbling with his net and trident, lunged awkwardly. Kiso, falling back on his legionary instincts, parried the trident with his scutum and stepped in, his blunted gladius striking the man's unarmored side with a sickening thud. The recruit gasped, dropping his weapons, his face contorting in pain. He wasn't seriously injured, but the impact, the raw reality of the blow, shook him. Pallas was there instantly. "Up, worm," he barked at the fallen recruit. "Pain is your teacher. Did you learn anything?" To Kiso, he said, "Too slow, Vero. You hesitated. In the arena, hesitation is death. Yours or his. Drive the attack. Commit." The lessons were brutal, etched not just in words but in bruises and aching limbs. Kiso learned quickly. He was a focused student, his mind absorbing the techniques, his body adapting to the demands. He learned to read the subtle shifts in an opponent's stance, the flicker of intent in their eyes. He learned the rhythm of combat, the ebb and flow of attack and defense. His first significant scar came not from an opponent, but from his own momentary lapse in concentration. During a drill focused on disarming techniques, Pallas, demonstrating with surprising speed for his bulk, flicked Kiso's practice gladius from his grasp. As Kiso reached for it, Pallas's follow-up strike with the rudis, meant for his shield, caught him on the forearm as he moved awkwardly. The wooden weapon, though blunted, struck with force, splitting the skin. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot up Kiso's arm. Blood welled from the wound, a startling crimson against his skin. He gritted his teeth, expecting a reprimand for his clumsiness. Instead, Pallas merely looked at the wound, then at Kiso's face. "A reminder, Vero," he said, his voice devoid of malice. "Even in practice, death is always present. Complacency is its invitation." He then gestured to the ludus medicus, who was always observing from the sidelines during weapons training. "Get that scene too. And learn from it." The medicus, a dour, world-weary Greek named Galenus, stitched the wound with practiced, indifferent hands, his touch surprisingly gentle despite his cynical demeanor. First of many, gladiator, Galenus muttered, not looking at Kiso's face. The sand will claim its due, one way or another. Some give it in blood, some in flesh, some in their whole lives. The scar, a thin white line that would remain on his forearm, became another mark of his transformation. It was a physical testament to the dangers inherent even in their preparation, a constant reminder of the stakes. Vibius, attempting the nimble, treacherous style of the retiarius, collected his own share of bruises and minor cuts. His natural agility and quick wit served him well, but the trident was an awkward weapon to master, and the net often seemed to have a mind of its own. He cursed frequently and colorfully, but he persevered, driven by a desperate desire to survive. He often sought Kiso's advice after training, discussing tactics, analyzing opponents. "That big German, Regenhar," Vibius would say, rubbing a bruised shoulder. "He's all brute force. But slow. If I can just keep out of his reach." Felix, choosing the Thraic style with its distinctive griffin-crested helmet, small square shield, and curved sicca, moved with a terrifying grace. His power was explosive, his attacks precise and deadly even with blunted weapons. He rarely spoke during training, his focus absolute. He seemed to tap into a primal warrior spirit, his movements fluid and dangerous. He and Kiso, though training for different styles, developed a mutual respect, recognizing the skill and dedication in each other. The training yard became a place of controlled violence, a laboratory for death. They learned not just how to fight, but how to perform a fight. Crixus, in particular, emphasized the theatrical aspects. "The crowd wants blood, yes," he'd say, "but they also want a story. A hero. A villain. Give them something to cheer for. Something to hate. A quick, clean kill is boring. Make it a spectacle." This was a difficult concept for Kiso to grasp. His legionary training had been about efficiency, about dispatching the enemy with minimal risk and effort. The idea of prolonging a fight for show, of toying with an opponent, felt alien and distasteful. Yet, he understood its grim necessity. Their lives depended not just on winning, but on winning in a way that pleased the unseen masses. The rudiments of death were being ingrained into their very beings. The awkwardness of their initial movements gave way to a grim proficiency. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the stomach before each sparring session, but it was now accompanied by a sharpened focus, a heightened awareness. They were learning the brutal arithmetic of the arena: kill or be killed, entertain or be forgotten. And with each new scar, each hard-won lesson, they moved one step closer to the blood-soaked sand that awaited them. Chapter 8, A Brotherhood Forged in Blood and Sweat. The relentless grind of the ludus calvus, designed to isolate and break individuals, paradoxically began to forge unexpected bonds. Shared suffering, it seemed, was a powerful adhesive. In the brief moments of respite between brutal training sessions, in the crowded squalor of the barracks at night, or during the hurried, communal meals, fragile connections were made, alliances formed, and a grim sort of camaraderie took root. Kiso, Vibius, and Felix found themselves gravitating towards each other. Their shared journey in chains had already laid a foundation, and the daily crucible of the ludus solidified it. They were an unlikely trio: Kiso, the stoic, observant former Roman auxiliary; Vibius, the sly, talkative ex-thief with a wit as sharp as any blade; and Felix, the proud, quiet Nubian warrior whose dignity remained unbent. Their bunk spaces, though meager, were near each other. In the evenings, after the last drills and the meager supper, when the guards were less vigilant and the doctors had retired, they would sometimes talk in low voices. They rarely spoke of the horrors of the day; those were a given, a shared burden that needed no articulation. Instead, they spoke of the lives they had lost. Vibius, surprisingly, was the most forthcoming. He'd spin tales of his exploits in the back alleys of Rome, his near misses with the vigiles, his short-lived triumphs as a gambler. His stories were often exaggerated, laced with a self-deprecating humor that belied the desperation of his former life. "Had a string of luck once with the knucklebones," he'd say, rubbing his chin. "Thought I was king of the Sabura for a week. Then a senator's son decided he didn't like losing to a gutter rat. And, well, here I am. Turns out, king is a temporary title." Felix spoke less, but when he did, his words carried weight. He described the vast, sun-baked plains of his homeland, the thrill of hunting lions not for sport but for survival, the intricate rituals and strong communal bonds of his tribe. His voice, usually a low rumble, would soften when he spoke of his family, his village, the stars in the desert sky. Listening to him, Kiso felt a pang of something akin to homesickness, not for Gaul specifically, but for a life where a man's worth wasn't measured by his ability to kill for entertainment. Kiso himself remained more guarded, the wounds of his betrayal still raw. But in the company of these two men, he found himself slowly, cautiously, opening up. He spoke of his father's pride in Rome, his mother's quiet resilience, the conflicting loyalties that had defined his life. He didn't speak of the accusation, the shame of being branded a traitor, but they sensed the unspoken pain. These shared moments were precious, fleeting islands of humanity in a sea of brutality. They would sometimes share extra scraps of food, if Vibius managed to scrounge any, or a wineskin he'd acquired. Vibius, with his nimble fingers, even taught Kiso and Felix a few simple gambling games using pebbles or carved wooden tokens, a brief distraction from the ever-present dread. Laughter, a rare and precious commodity in the ludus, would sometimes erupt, quickly stifled, but nonetheless a vital release. This tentative brotherhood was not built on sentimentality, but on a pragmatic understanding of their shared predicament. They watched each other's backs, not just in the barracks, but in the training yard. If one man faltered during a particularly grueling drill, another might offer a subtle word of encouragement or a quick, supportive gesture that the doctors wouldn't notice. During sparring, while the imperative was still to fight hard, there was an unspoken understanding between them: push each other, test each other, but avoid causing unnecessary injury. This was a stark contrast to the brutal, often vindictive, sparring that occurred with some of the other recruits, particularly the aggressive German, Regenhar. Regenhar was a force of nature, a hulking barbarian who seemed to revel in the violence. He saw any form of camaraderie as weakness, any quiet conversation as conspiracy. He particularly seemed to resent Kiso's calm, calculating demeanor and Felix's quiet pride. He would often try to provoke them, his taunts crude and inflammatory. "Look at the little Roman soldier," Regenhar would sneer at Kiso during water breaks. "Still thinks his legions will save him. They threw you to us, dog." Kiso usually ignored him, his impassivity often enraging the German further. Felix would simply stare Regenhar down, his silent contempt a more potent weapon than any insult. Vibius, wisely, made himself scarce whenever Regenhar was in a belligerent mood. The bonds between Kiso, Vibius, and Felix were also tested by the inherent competitiveness of the ludus. Calvus and the doctors actively fostered rivalry, knowing it would hone their fighting skills and make for better spectacles in the arena. Privileges, slightly better food, a less crowded bunk, even a chance at better equipment, were sometimes awarded to those who excelled, those who caught the Lanista's eye. This inevitably created tension, a constant awareness that every other gladiator was a potential opponent, a rival for survival. Yet, their shared trauma seemed to outweigh these divisive forces, at least for now. They understood, perhaps better than most, that their only true allies in this hell were each other. They had seen men break under the pressure, succumbing to despair or turning on their fellows like starving dogs over a scrap of meat. Kiso, Vibius, and Felix, each in their own way, resisted that descent. One evening, after a day where Pallas had been particularly brutal, pushing them to the very edge of their endurance, they sat in the near darkness of their corner of the barracks. Vibius was uncharacteristically quiet, nursing a badly bruised arm. Felix was methodically cleaning a small, intricately carved wooden bird he kept hidden in his tunic, a memento of his past life. Sometimes, Vibius finally said, his voice barely a whisper, I think they want us to hate each other more than they want us to learn to fight. Hate is a tool for them, Felix rumbled, not looking up from his carving. It makes us eager for the kill. It makes us forget we are all just slaves in their game. Kiso nodded slowly. But it doesn't have to be our tool. He looked at his two companions, their faces shadowed, their bodies bearing the fresh marks of the day's training. We were something else before this. Soldiers, hunters, thieves, men. They can take our freedom, but they don't have to take all of that. It was a fragile sentiment, easily shattered by the grim realities of their world. But in that moment, it felt true. They were bound together not just by chains and shared suffering, but by a quiet, unspoken understanding. They were individuals, struggling to retain some sliver of their former selves in a system designed to erase them. Their brotherhood, forged in blood and sweat, was a small act of defiance, a testament to the enduring human need for connection, even in the shadow of the arena. It was a lifeline in the maelstrom, a source of strength that might, just might, help them face whatever horrors lay ahead. Chapter 9, Learning the Styles, Murmillo, Retiarius, Thrax. As the weeks turned into months, the initial, generalized training gave way to more specialized instruction. Doctors Pallas and Crixus began to focus intently on honing the recruits in their chosen gladiatorial styles. The Ludus Calvus, like all such schools, aimed to produce a variety of fighters, not just for tactical reasons within the arena, but to cater to the diverse, often fickle, tastes of the Roman crowd. Each style, with its unique armor, weaponry, and fighting philosophy, offered a different kind of spectacle. Kiso, committed to the path of the secutor, found himself under Pallas's direct and often unsparing tutelage. The secutor, or pursuer, was a heavily armored gladiator, designed specifically to combat the lightly armed but agile Retiarius. His equipment was both a strength and a weakness. The large, oblong scutum offered excellent protection, while the distinctive, smooth, almost featureless helmet with its small eyeholes protected the face from the Retiarius's trident but severely restricted vision and hearing. The gladius was his primary offensive weapon, ideal for close-quarters thrusting. Pallas drilled Kiso relentlessly in the art of relentless pressure. "You are the wolf, Vero, the Retiarius is the deer," he'd bark, his rudis rapping against Kiso's shield. "The deer is faster, more agile. But the wolf is stronger, more persistent. You do not give him space to breathe, to think. You cut off his escape. You wear him down. Your armor is your advantage in endurance, his lack of it is his advantage in speed. You must negate his speed with your relentless advance." Kiso learned to fight in a semi-crouched position. His shield held high, peering through the narrow slits of his practice helmet. The world became a tunnel, sounds muffled, his reliance on instinct and the subtle cues of his opponent's body language paramount. He practiced endless footwork drills, learning to pivot, to advance, to cut off angles, all while maintaining the integrity of his shield wall. He learned to use the scutum itself as a weapon, bashing with its heavy boss to create openings for his gladius. The style was physically demanding, requiring immense stamina to carry the heavy armor and maintain constant pressure. It was a grim, attritional way of fighting, less about flashy moves and more about brutal efficiency. Vibius, with his natural quickness and wiry build, had gravitated towards the Retiarius, the net fighter. His equipment was minimal, a weighted net, reti, a trident, facina or tridents, and a dagger, pugio. He wore no helmet and little armor, usually just a loincloth and a metal shoulder guard, gallerus, on his left arm. His survival depended on speed, agility, and the skillful use of his net to entangle his heavily armored opponents, primarily the secutor or murmillo. Dr. Crixus, himself a former Retiarius, took Vibius under his wing. Crixus was a demanding teacher, his movements a blur, his training net flicking out with pinpoint accuracy. "The net is your lover and your betrayer, boy," Crixus would exclaim, as Vibius struggled to cast the weighted net correctly. "Treat her well, understand her moods, and she will deliver your enemy to you. Fumble, disrespect her, and she will leave you naked before his sword." Vibius spent hours practicing the flick of the wrist, the precise moment of release, learning to cast the net so it spread wide and true. He learned to use the trident not just for thrusting but for keeping his opponent at bay, for tripping, for probing defenses. He practiced evasive footwork, darting in and out, always moving, making himself a difficult target. The retiarius style was a high-risk, high-reward gamble. A successful net cast could immobilize an opponent, leaving him vulnerable. A miss could mean a swift, brutal end. Vibius, with his gambler's spirit and inherent slipperiness, seemed suited to this deadly game of chance. His gallows humor often came to the fore during training. "Just trying to catch a big fish, doctor," he'd quip, after a particularly clumsy net throw. Crixus would usually respond with a stinging flick of his own net. Felix, with his powerful physique and natural athleticism, had chosen the Thraex, or Thracian, style. The Thraex was a crowd pleaser, known for his distinctive griffin-crested helmet with its wide brim, a small, square or round shield, parmula, and the signature weapon, the Sicca, a short, curved sword designed to slash around an opponent's shield. He also wore greaves on both legs. The Thraex often fought against the Murmillo, another heavily armed gladiator, leading to spectacular clashes of steel. Pallas, though primarily a Murmillo specialist, recognized Felix's potential and guided his training in the Thraex style. "The Sicca is a wicked blade, Nubian," Pallas would say, demonstrating a slashing arc, "it bites where other swords cannot reach. But your shield is small. You must be aggressive, always attacking, using your speed and the curve of your blade to find the gaps. You are the hawk, swift and deadly." Felix took to the Thraex style with a terrifying grace. His movements were a blend of power and agility, his Sicca flashing in intricate patterns. He learned to use his small shield actively, not just for defense but to deflect and create openings. He seemed to draw on an inner well of warrior spirit, his eyes burning with intensity during sparring. He was a naturally gifted fighter, and the flamboyant, aggressive nature of the Thraex suited his proud, unyielding demeanor. The crowd, Pallas noted with satisfaction, would love him. Then there was Regenhar, the hulking German. He was a natural fit for the Murmillo. Like the Secutor, the Murmillo was heavily armed, wearing a large, distinctive helmet often adorned with a fish crest, the Muris, or sea fish, from which the name derived, a large scutum, and a gladius. He typically wore a manica, arm guard, on his sword arm and an acria, greave, on his left leg. The Murmillo was the classic heavy infantryman of the arena, relying on strength, armor, and straightforward, brutal aggression. Pallas spent considerable time with Regenhar, honing his raw power into something more directed, if no less savage. Regenhar fought with a berserker-like fury, his blows with the practiced gladius powerful enough to splinter shields and send opponents staggering. He lacked finesse, but his sheer ferocity was intimidating. He seemed to relish the impact, the feeling of his weapon connecting, the grunts of pain from his sparring partners. He and Kiso, as potential Secutor and Murmillo respectively, styles often pitted against each other or similar types, developed a particularly sharp rivalry in the training yard, their sparring sessions often escalating into genuine, brutal exchanges that Pallas would have to step in to control. The differences in their chosen styles began to reflect, or perhaps even shape, their personalities within the ludus. Kiso became more withdrawn, more observant, his mind constantly calculating angles and odds, his movements economical and purposeful. Vibius grew more animated, his banter sharper, his movements quick and evasive, always looking for an opening, a slight edge. Felix became a figure of controlled power, his silence often more intimidating than any shout. His attacks sudden and devastating. Regenhar remained a brooding, explosive force of pure aggression. Learning these specialized styles was not just about mastering weapons and armor, it was about internalizing a new identity, a role they would be expected to play in the deadly theater of the arena. The choice of style was, in many ways, a choice of how they would face death, and how they would be remembered, if at all. The lanista, Gnaeus Calvus, would often observe these specialized training sessions, his obsidian eyes calculating, assessing the potential matchups, the crowd appeal, the profitability of each developing fighter. For him, they were not men learning to survive, but assets being polished for market, each with a specific niche to fill in the grand, bloody spectacle Rome demanded. Chapter 10, The Hierarchy of the Ludus, From Novice to Veteran. Life within the Ludus Calvus was not a flat, undifferentiated mass of suffering. Like any society, however brutal, it quickly developed its own internal power structures, its own unwritten rules and hierarchies. For a tyro, a novice gladiator like Kiso, navigating these currents was almost as crucial for survival as mastering the rudiments of combat. At the absolute bottom were the newcomers, the fresh meat, scared, disoriented, and utterly vulnerable. They received the worst dural bunks, the last pick of the meager rations, and the brunt of the guards' casual cruelty. They were figures of contempt for some of the more established gladiators, who saw in them a reminder of their own fearful beginnings, or simply as easy targets for petty dominance. Above the Tyrones were those who had survived their initial months, who had shown some aptitude and training, and who had perhaps even endured their first, terrifying taste of the arena sand, even if it was only in a Pelusio, a mock combat with blunted weapons before the main games. These men carried themselves with a little more confidence, though the fear was never far from their eyes. They had learned the routines, the unspoken rules, and the personalities of the doctors and guards. Then came the veterani, the veterans. These were the men who had fought and survived multiple real combats. Their bodies were roadmaps of scars, each one a story of a near miss, a hard-won victory, or a painful defeat endured. They moved with a grim assurance, their eyes holding a weary knowledge that set them apart. The veterani commanded a certain respect, even from the guards and, to a lesser extent, from the doctors. They had proven their worth in the only currency that mattered in the Ludus, survival and spectacle. The privileges of a veteran were few but significant in the context of their deprived existence. They might get slightly better food, perhaps a piece of meat or an extra ladle of wine. Their bunk spaces were often in the more desirable, less crowded areas of the barracks. They might have access to slightly better practice equipment, or even be allowed small, personal items that would be confiscated from a tyro. Some veterans were even permitted to earn a small peculium, a tiny sum of money, from gifts given by appreciative, or gambling, members of the crowd, though Calvus undoubtedly took the lion's share. One such veteran was Quintus, a man known as the Red Wolf for his fiery red hair and the savage, unrelenting style he employed as a mirmillo. Quintus was in his late 30s, ancient by gladiator standards. His face was a crisscross of old scars, one eye slightly clouded from an old injury. He had fought in arenas across the empire, from Gaul to Greece, and had somehow, against all odds, survived. He was a cynical, world-weary man, but not gratuitously cruel. He had seen too much death, too much suffering, to waste energy on petty bullying. Quintus often watched the Tyrones train, a battered wooden cup of cheap wine in his hand, his expression unreadable. Sometimes, he would offer a gruff, unsolicited piece of advice. "You, soldier boy," he said to Kiso one evening, after watching him spar with another recruit. Kiso had won, but it had been a clumsy, exhausting affair. "You think too much. Legionary head on your shoulders. Good for staying alive on campaign. Bad for the sand." Kiso, wiping sweat from his brow, looked at the veteran. "What do you mean, Quintus?" "Out there," Quintus gestured vaguely towards the imagined roar of the Colosseum, "they don't want a chess match. They want blood. They want passion. Your Roman discipline, it's cold. Clean. Efficient. They might respect it for a while. But they won't love you for it. And if they don't love you, they won't demand you be spared when your opponent has you on your knees." He took a swig of wine. "Die well, and maybe they'll give you wine after. Or maybe they'll just piss on your corpse. It's a roll of the dice, every time." His words were bleak, but Kiso sensed a truth in them, a hard-earned wisdom. Quintus wasn't trying to discourage him, but to impart a harsh reality of their existence. The hierarchy extended to the relationships between gladiators themselves. Veterans often acted as informal mentors or, conversely, as tormentors to the newer recruits. Alliances formed, usually based on shared ethnicity, fighting style, or simply a grudging respect earned in the training yard. Rivalries were even more common, actively encouraged by Calvus and the doctors to sharpen their competitive edge. Regenhar, the German, quickly established himself as a dominant force among the newer recruits through sheer intimidation and brutality. He gathered a small clique of similarly aggressive gladiators around him, and they often made life miserable for the weaker or more isolated Tyrones, stealing food, sabotaging equipment, or instigating fights. Kiso, Vibius, and Felix, with their established bond, managed to avoid the worst of this. Their combined presence, Kiso's quiet intensity, Felix's imposing strength, and Vibius's surprising ability to defuse tense situations with a well-timed quip or a feigned act of subservience, offered a degree of mutual protection. They became a small, cohesive unit within the larger, fractured society of the Ludus. Navigating this internal power structure required constant vigilance. A careless word, a perceived slight, stepping on the wrong veteran's toes, any of these could lead to a beating in a dark corner of the barracks or being set up for failure in the training yard. Kiso learned to observe, to listen, to speak little unless necessary. He learned who to avoid, who might offer a sliver of grudging respect, and who was simply a dangerous variable. The doctors, Pallas and Crixus, stood somewhat apart from this internal hierarchy, yet they were deeply embedded within it. They had been gladiators themselves, they understood the dynamics. They wielded their authority absolutely during training, but they also knew which veterans could be relied upon to maintain a semblance of order, or to enforce their will, within the barracks. They recognized talent and potential, but also ruthlessly culled weakness. Gnaeus Calvus, the Lanista, sat at the apex of this brutal pyramid. His word was law. He could elevate a gladiator with a nod, or condemn him with a frown. He manipulated the rivalries, played favorites, and used the promise of rewards or the threat of punishment to keep his family in line. His spies were everywhere, and little happened within the walls of the Ludus Calvus that did not eventually reach his ears. For a tyro like Kiso, the journey from novice to even a low-ranking member of the Ludus's established order was fraught with peril. Every day was a test, not just of physical endurance and fighting skill, but of resilience, cunning, and the ability to navigate a treacherous social landscape where the rules were unwritten and constantly shifting. Survival meant more than just learning to wield a sword, it meant learning to understand the subtle currents of power, fear, and desperation that governed the lives of every man trapped within the Lanista's shadow. The hierarchy was a ladder, but for most, it led only to a higher precipice from which to fall. Part 2, The Roar of the Crowd. Chapter 11, The Eve of the Games, A Night of Ghosts and Whispers. The air in the Ludus Calvus had changed. For weeks, the usual undercurrent of dread had been amplified, sharpened by a nervous energy that was almost palpable. The Munera, the gladiatorial games, were approaching. Gnaeus Calvus had secured a lucrative contract to provide a significant number of fighters for the upcoming festival in the grand amphitheater of Capua. The Lanista was in a fever of activity, his reedy voice sharper, his eyes gleaming with avarice and anticipation. For the gladiators, particularly the Tyrones who had yet to taste the sand of a real arena, the approaching games were a looming specter. The training intensified, Pallas and Crixus pushing them with a renewed, almost frantic urgency. Every drill, every sparring match, now carried the weight of impending reality. There was less tolerance for error, punishments were swifter, and the unspoken question hung heavy in the air: who would be chosen? And of those chosen, who would return? The eve of the games was a night unlike any other Kiso had experienced in the Ludus. The usual cacophony of the barracks was subdued, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence punctuated by hushed whispers, nervous coughs, and the occasional, quickly stifled sob. The air was thick with fear, with unspoken prayers to forgotten gods, with the ghosts of past failures and the terrifying uncertainty of the morrow. Kiso lay on his hard bunk, staring up at the rough-hewn wooden planks above. Sleep was an impossibility. His mind replayed every lesson. Every drill, every piece of advice Quintus or the doctors had ever offered. He felt the familiar ache in his muscles, the phantom sting of old wounds, the weight of the practice armor he would soon exchange for the real thing. He thought of his father, Titus Varro. The old legionary had seen his share of battles, had faced death many times. Kiso remembered him speaking of the night before a major engagement, the quiet rituals, the sharpening of blades, the letters written home. But this was different. This was not war, fought for a cause, however flawed. This was spectacle. This was men killing men for the entertainment of a mob. His father had once said, with a soldier's grim pragmatism, Rome breaks what it can't rule. Kiso now understood a deeper layer to that truth. Rome also consumed what it broke, turning it into a gruesome form of entertainment. Around him, the other gladiators were engaged in their own private rituals of preparation or despair. He saw one man, a young Celt with wide, terrified eyes, meticulously cleaning his practice gladius, his movements jerky and obsessive. Another, a grizzled Dacian veteran, sat cross-legged, chanting softly in a language Kiso didn't understand, his eyes closed, his face a mask of stoic resignation. Vibius, usually so talkative, was uncharacteristically quiet, fidgeting with a small, smooth stone he always carried. He caught Kiso's eye in the dim light filtering from a single sputtering oil lamp. "Can't sleep?" Vibius whispered, his voice raspy. Kiso shook his head. "You. Feels like a flock of vultures is roosting in my stomach," Vibius admitted. He tossed the stone in his hand. "Been trying to remember every dirty trick Crixus ever taught me. And a few of my own." He attempted a grin, but it was a pale imitation of his usual bravado. "You think they'll have good wine for the winners? Assuming, there are any." Felix sat nearby, a silent, imposing figure even in the gloom. He was methodically sharpening the blunted edges of his practice sicca with a piece of stone, the rhythmic rasping sound a counterpoint to the nervous quiet. His focus was absolute, his movements economical. He seemed to have retreated into some inner fortress, a place of warrior calm that Kiso envied. Some men were writing on the rough stone walls of the barracks with charcoal or a sharpened piece of flint. Their names. A simple, desperate attempt to leave some mark, some proof that they had existed, before they were potentially erased by the sand. Kiso watched them, a cold knot in his own stomach. What name would he write? Kiso Varro, the disgraced legionary? Or simply Kiso, the gladiator, a name that was not yet his own, but was being forced upon him? He heard whispers of Spartacus. The legendary Thracian gladiator who had led a rebellion from this very region, shaking the foundations of Rome itself. His name was a potent symbol, a dangerous myth whispered in the darkest corners of every ludus. For some, it was a source of inspiration, a flicker of hope for defiance. For most, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the brutal, overwhelming power of Rome and the ultimate futility of resistance. Tonight, the ghost of Spartacus seemed to walk the corridors of Ludus Calvus, a reminder of both the dream of freedom and the price of failure. Later, Quintus, the Red Wolf, passed by Kiso's bunk. The veteran's face was grim in the flickering lamplight. "First time is always the worst, soldier boy," Quintus said, his voice low. "The noise, it hits you like a wave. And the smell. Sweat, blood, fear, and the damn perfume of the rich bastards in the good seats. Try not to let it swallow you. Any advice?" Kiso asked, grateful for any word from a man who had walked this path so many times. Quintus grunted. "Find your center. Focus on your opponent. Everything else is just noise. And if you get the chance, kill clean. Don't play with them, not your first time. Just get it done. Survive. That's all that matters tomorrow." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "and say a prayer to whatever gods you still believe in. Can't hurt." He clapped Kiso roughly on the shoulder and moved on. A weary sentinel making his rounds through a barracks filled with condemned men. The night wore on, an agonizing crawl of hours. Kiso tried to clear his mind, to focus on his breathing, on the techniques Pallas had drilled into him. But images kept intruding, the faces of the men he had killed in battle, the sneering face of Legate Drusus, the impersonal cruelty of the brand. And now, the faceless, roaring crowd he would soon confront. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, a stark awareness of his own mortality. Here, on the eve of his potential death, he was stripped down to his most basic self, a man facing the abyss. The bravado, the anger, the discipline, they were all just layers, defenses against the primal fear that now gnawed at him. As the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, a horn blew, not the usual harsh clang of the morning summons, but a deeper, more mournful note. It was the call for those chosen for the games. A new kind of silence fell over the barracks, a silence filled with dread and a grim, fatalistic anticipation. The time for ghosts and whispers was over. The time for blood and sand was about to begin. Kiso rose from his bunk, his body stiff, his mind strangely calm, as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. He was going to the arena, Chapter 12, the Pampa, Parade of the Condemned, adored by the mob. The chosen gladiators were separated from the others, a grim procession into the central courtyard where Gnaeus Calvus, resplendent in a freshly dyed purple tunic that did little to hide his paunch, awaited them. His usual shrewd expression was amplified by an almost manic excitement. Today was a day of profit, a day his family would showcase their deadly talents. Today, you cease to be worms. Calvus announced, his voice ringing with false bonhomie. Today, you become gods. Or at least, the playthings of gods and emperors. He chuckled at his own wit, a sound that grated on Kiso's nerves. You will march in the Pampa, the grand procession. Let the citizens of Capua see you. Let them choose their favorites. Let them place their bets. They were stripped of their rough ludus tunics and given more elaborate, if still coarse, garments. Kiso, as a secutor, was given a dark, almost black tunic, trimmed with a surprisingly vibrant crimson. Others, depending on their gladiatorial type, received different colors and adornments, a flash of bronze for a murmillo's belt, a net-like pattern on a retiarius's loincloth. It was all part of the show, designed to differentiate them, to make them more visually appealing to the crowd. Their practice weapons were taken, and they were issued with their real arena gear. Kiso hefted his scutum, its polished wood gleaming, the iron boss cold and heavy. He strapped on his greaves, the leather creaking. The secutor helmet, with its smooth, enclosed faceplate, felt heavier, more constricting than the practice version. Looking through its narrow eye slits, the world became a menacing, distorted tunnel. This was no longer training. This was real. Vibius, beside him, was a study in nervous energy, his hands constantly adjusting the gallerus on his shoulder, his eyes darting around. He wore a loincloth of startling blue, a stark contrast to his pale skin. Felix, magnificent in the Thraex armor, his griffin-crested helmet catching the light, stood like a dark statue, his expression unreadable, though Kiso could sense the coiled tension within him. Regenhar, the German Murmillo, seemed to swell with anticipation, his scarred face flushed, a savage grin plastered across his lips. He pounded his fist against his new, brightly painted shield. They were led out of the Ludus gates, not through the back alleys this time, but towards the main thoroughfares of Capua. The transition was jarring. One moment they were within the familiar, oppressive confines of the school, the next, they were thrust into the vibrant, chaotic reality of the city streets, already thronged with people heading towards the amphitheater. The Pampa had already begun. Ahead of them marched musicians playing blaring horns and pounding drums, their discordant music designed to stir excitement. There were priests in ceremonial robes, city magistrates in their togas, and attendants carrying banners and images of the gods and the emperor. And then, them. The gladiators. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. A wave of noise washed over them, cheers, jeers, shouts, laughter, and a cacophony of individual comments. "Look at the size of that Nubian," someone yelled, pointing at Felix. The retiarius looks quick. I'll put 5 denarii on him, another voice called out. That's secure, he has the look of a killer, a woman shrieked, her eyes wide and avid as she stared at Kiso. Kiso felt a flush of humiliation rise up his neck. He was an exhibit, a piece of meat on parade, being judged and appraised by 1,000 hungry eyes. He tried to keep his gaze fixed forward, to adopt the impassive mask he had learned in the legions, but it was difficult. The sheer press of humanity, the intensity of their stares, the raw, almost primal energy emanating from the crowd, was unnerving. This was not the controlled environment of the Ludus. This was a mob, eager for spectacle, hungry for blood. He saw faces in the crowd, old men and young boys, wealthy matrons adorned with jewels and poor laborers in patched tunics, soldiers off duty and merchants taking a break from their stalls. They were all united in their anticipation of the violence to come. Some threw flowers, a strange, almost perverse gesture of adoration for men about to die. Others threw insults, or rotten fruit. Vibius, surprisingly, seemed to be feeding off the energy, a nervous, almost manic grin on his face. He even offered a small, theatrical wave to a group of cheering women, earning a sharp glance from one of the guards. Felix marched with his head held high, his gaze fixed on some distant point, impervious to the jeers and cheers alike, a figure of stoic dignity amidst the chaos. Regan harpooed, flexing his muscles, roaring back at the crowd, reveling in the attention. Kiso felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. This wasn't war, it was, as Quintus had said, theater. A grotesque, bloody theater where the actors might actually die. He saw the awe on some faces as they gazed at the imposing amphitheater looming ahead, its massive stone arches a testament to Rome's power and its insatiable appetite for spectacle. He felt a surge of his old resentment, mixed with a new, cold dread. These people, his own people by his father's blood, were here to watch him fight, to potentially watch him die, and they were excited by the prospect. As they neared the massive entrance to the amphitheater, the Porta Triumphalis, the roar of the crowd already inside the vast bowl was a physical force, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the ground, through Kiso's very bones. The scale of it was overwhelming. The Ludus Calvus, which had seemed like its own oppressive world, was dwarfed by this colossal monument to death and entertainment. They marched through the dark, echoing tunnels beneath the stands, the air growing cooler, thick with the smell of damp earth, animals, and the faint, lingering scent of old blood. The noise from the arena above grew louder, more distinct, the roar of tens of thousands of voices, a sound like the crashing of a relentless sea. They were herded into a series of holding cells, cramped, dimly lit spaces beneath the arena floor. Here, the bravado of the Pampa began to evaporate, replaced by a stark, tangible fear. The sounds from above were deafening. Kiso could hear the announcer's voice, amplified by the acoustics of the arena, though he couldn't make out the words. He heard bursts of cheering, occasional gasps, the thud of something heavy hitting the sand. The games had already begun, perhaps the venations, the animal hunts, or the execution of the Noxii, the condemned criminals. Kiso sat on a cold stone bench, his helmet resting on his knees. He took slow, deep breaths, trying to find that center Quintus had spoken of. He was no longer Kiso Vero, the auxiliary scout. He was not even Kiso the tyro. Today, he was simply a gladiator, a nameless instrument in a vast, bloody machine. His identity was stripped away, leaving only the grim purpose for which he had been trained. The procession had been a perverse mockery of a triumphal march. They were the condemned, paraded before their executioners, yet adored by them in a twisted display of public fascination. The roar of the crowd, which had seemed distant and abstract before, was now an immediate, terrifying presence, the sound of the beast they were about to feed. Chapter 13, First Blood in the Sand, the arena's baptism. The wait in the holding cells was an agony of suspense. Each roar from the arena above, each sudden crescendo of noise, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Kiso's system. He could hear the guttural sounds of animals, the screams of men, the relentless, hungry clamor of the crowd. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of fresh blood, seeping down from the sand above, a grim perfume of what was to come. A guard, his face impassive, appeared at the barred gate of their cell. Secutor vero. Retiarius Vibius. You're up. Kiso's heart hammered against his ribs. Vibius, beside him, went pale, his earlier nervous energy collapsing into a visible tremor. Felix, who was not in this first pairing, gave Kiso a solemn nod, a silent gesture of solidarity. Remember your training, Pallas's voice echoed in Kiso's mind. Find your center. Survive. They were led through a narrow, ascending tunnel that opened directly onto the sun-drenched expanse of the arena. The transition was blinding, disorienting. After the gloom of the holding cells, the sudden glare of the sun on the yellow sand was almost painful. And the noise, it was a physical assault, a tidal wave of sound from tens of thousands of throats, crashing down on him, engulfing him. The amphitheater was a dizzying coliseum of faces, a vast, tiered bowl stretching up to the sky, every seat seemingly occupied. Banners snapped in the breeze. The imperial box, draped in purple, was prominent, though Kiso couldn't make out the distant figures within. All he could see were eyes, countless eyes, all focused on him and Vibius as they stepped onto the blood-soaked sand. The arena floor was larger than any training yard, a vast, empty stage. Patches of darker sand marked where previous combats had ended. A faint, sweetish, metallic odor hung in the air, the smell of death. Their opponent was already there, waiting. Or rather, opponents. Calvus, in his wisdom or cruelty, had decided to pit his two Tyrones against a pair of seasoned, if unremarkable, gladiators from another ludus, a burly Murmillo and a wiry, experienced-looking Thracian. It was a baptism by fire, a brutal test. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, introducing them, their names lost in the general roar. Kiso barely heard it. His focus narrowed, his senses heightening. He saw the Murmillo opposite him, a thick-set man with a boar's tusk emblem on his shield. The man's eyes, visible through his helmet slits, were hard and pitiless. This was it. No more practice. No more blunted weapons. This was for his life. Instinct, honed by months of brutal training and years of legionary discipline, took over. He settled into his secutor stance, shield up, gladius held ready, his body a coiled spring. He could feel Vibius beside him, a nervous, twitching presence, his net held loosely, his trident point wavering slightly. The signal was given, a blast from a horn. The Murmillo charged, a guttural roar erupting from his helmet, his gladius held high. Kiso met the charge, his scutum taking the brunt of the initial impact with a jarring thud that resonated up his arm. Steel scraped against steel. He pushed back, using his shield to create space, his gladius probing for an opening. The fight was a blur of motion, a chaotic symphony of clanging metal, grunts of exertion, and the deafening roar of the crowd. Kiso moved on autopilot, his body remembering the drills, Pallas's commands echoing in his mind. Pressure. Relentless. No quarter. He focused on his opponent, shutting out the noise, the fear, the overwhelming spectacle. He saw an opening as the Murmillo overextended on a swing. Kiso lunged, his gladius aimed low. The blade skittered off the Murmillo's greave with a shriek of metal, but the force of the thrust made the man stumble. Meanwhile, Vibius was engaged in a desperate dance with the Thracian. The Retiarius was all movement, darting in and out, his net flicking, his trident probing. The Thracian, more experienced, pressed him hard, his curved sicca flashing dangerously. Kiso spared a glance, saw Vibius narrowly evade a slash that would have opened his side. Kiso's opponent recovered, pressing the attack again. The man was strong, his blows heavy. Kiso gave ground, parrying, blocking, looking for another chance. He could feel the strain in his shield arm, the sweat trickling into his eyes beneath the helmet. The sun beat down, making the armor feel like an oven. Then, he saw his chance. The Murmillo, frustrated, lunged recklessly. Kiso sidestepped, the man's gladius whistling past his ear. For a fraction of a second, the Murmillo's side was exposed. Kiso didn't hesitate. He thrust with all his strength. His gladius punched through the man's tunic, into flesh and bone. He felt the sickening resistance, then the give. A choked gasp came from the Murmillo's helmet. The man staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and pain behind the visor. He dropped his sword, clutching at his side where dark blood was already staining the sand. He looked down at the spreading stain, then up at Kiso, a look of disbelief on his face. Then, he crumpled to his knees, and pitched forward onto the sand. A wave of nausea washed over Kiso. He had killed him. A man. Not an enemy soldier in the heat of battle, but a performer in a deadly game. The crowd roared, a sound that was both exultant and horrifying. He barely had time to register it. The Thracian, seeing his partner fall, let out a yell of rage and turned his attention to Kiso, abandoning Vibius for a moment. The Thracian was fast, his sicca a blur. Kiso raised his shield, deflecting a flurry of blows. Vibius, seeing his opportunity, seized it. With a desperate cry, he cast his net. It sailed through the air, a perfect throw, and enveloped the Thracian's upper body and sword arm. The Thracian roared in frustration, struggling against the entangling cords. Now, Kiso! Now! Vibius shrieked, his voice cracking. Kiso advanced. The Thracian, tangled in the net, was vulnerable. He tried to draw his dagger with his free hand, but Kiso was too quick. He brought his scutum down hard on the Thracian's helmeted head with a sickening crunch. The man sagged, stunned. Before Kiso could deliver a finishing blow, the Thracian, dazed but not finished, managed to look up towards the imperial box. He raised a shaking hand, 2 fingers extended, the plea for mercy. The arena fell into a momentary, expectant hush. All eyes turned to the distant, purple-draped box. Kiso stood, panting, his sword still raised, Vibius beside him, trident poised. Then came the signal. A thumb. Turned down. The crowd erupted again, a savage, bloodthirsty roar. The Thracian slumped, his brief hope extinguished. He looked at Kiso, his eyes visible now through the visor, filled with a tired resignation. Kiso hesitated for a heart-stopping moment. This man was defeated, helpless. But the crowd demanded death. The emperor demanded death. His own survival depended on obeying. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then drove his gladius into the Thracian's exposed throat. It was a quick, brutal end. Silence. Then, an even greater roar. Victory. Kiso stood, his chest heaving, his sword dripping. Vibius was beside him, leaning heavily on his trident, his face ashen but alight with a wild, shocked relief. They had survived. They had killed. Attendants rushed onto the sand to drag away the bodies. Kiso watched them go, a profound emptiness hollowed out within him. The exhilaration of survival was already being tainted by the bitter taste of what he had done. He looked at his hands, stained with the blood of another man. He had taken his first blood in the sand. He had been baptized into the brutal rites of the arena. As he and Vibius were led away, back towards the holding cells, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in his ears, Kiso felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to vomit. He stumbled behind the stands, away from the prying eyes, and retched violently, his body expelling not just the meager contents of his stomach, but something of his soul as well. The roar of the crowd had been a terrifying, intoxicating wave. He had survived it. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that a part of Kiso Vero, the man he once was, had died out there on the blood-soaked sand, alongside the men he had just killed. The arena had claimed its first piece of him, Chapter 14, the roar and the silence, living for the crowd's whim. The aftermath of his first fight was a disorienting blur. Back in the relative quiet of the holding cells, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving Kiso feeling drained, shaky, and strangely detached. Vibius was babbling, a mixture of relief, shock, and a dawning, almost giddy realization that they were still alive. He clapped Kiso on the back, his eyes bright and unfocused. "We did it, soldier boy. We actually did it. By the gods, I thought that Thracian had me." Kiso could only nod, his throat tight. The image of the Murmillo's disbelieving eyes, the Thracian's resigned slump, were seared into his memory. He felt the phantom weight of his gladius in his hand, the sickening sensation of the blade entering flesh. Gnaeus Calvus appeared, his face wreathed in a self-satisfied smirk. "Excellent, Varro. Excellent, Vibius. A fine debut. The crowd loved it. Especially your little net trick, Vibius, very theatrical." He clapped his hands together. "You've earned your keep today, boys. You've earned your keep." His eyes, however, held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a merchant pleased with his investment's initial return. Later, after the games had concluded for the day, they were herded back to the Ludus Calvus. The atmosphere in the barracks was different. Those who had fought and survived, like Kiso and Vibius, were regarded with a new mixture of awe and apprehension by the Tyrones who had yet to face the sand. Felix, who had also fought later in the day and won his match with a spectacular, crowd-pleasing display of Thracian aggression, was greeted with murmurs of respect. Regenhar, too, had been victorious, his brutal efficiency earning him guttural cheers from a certain segment of the crowd. But there were empty bunks. Men who had marched out in the Pampa that morning had not returned. Their meager possessions were already being silently divided amongst the survivors, a grim reminder of the arena's toll. In the days and weeks that followed, Kiso fought again. And again. Each time, he stepped onto the sand, the roar of the crowd was a deafening wave. He learned to manage the fear, to channel it into a cold, focused aggression. He learned to read the fickle moods of the audience. The subtle shifts in their cries that could mean the difference between a plea for mercy being granted or denied. His name, Kiso the Calm, began to circulate amongst the gambling dens and wine shops of Capua. His measured, almost surgical style, a stark contrast to the wild flailing of some gladiators or the flamboyant showmanship of others, intrigued a certain segment of the crowd. They respected his efficiency, his apparent lack of fear, the way he dispatched his opponents with a deadly, almost emotionless precision. But Kiso saw through it. He knew the crowd didn't care about the man beneath the helmet. They cared about the myth, the spectacle. He was a character in their bloody drama, his life a wager, his death a potential thrill. He saw the faces in the stands, the bored aristocrats seeking a jolt of excitement, the common folk vicariously experiencing power and violence, the wide-eyed children already being indoctrinated into the empire's brutal entertainments. The power of the audience was both intoxicating and terrifying. A well-placed blow, a dramatic fall, a display of unexpected courage, these could turn the tide of their sentiment. A moment of perceived cowardice or clumsiness could earn their scorn, and with it, the downward thumb. The emperor's presence, or that of a high-ranking magistrate, amplified this dynamic tenfold. Their whims were absolute. A gladiator might fight bravely, might even have his opponent at his mercy, but if the dignitary in the purple-draped box was displeased, or simply capricious, a life could be extinguished with a casual gesture. Kiso witnessed this firsthand when a popular secutor from another ludus, a man known for his showmanship, was denied mercy after a slip, simply because the visiting governor seemed bored. The man died, bewildered, the cheers of his erstwhile fans turning instantly to jeers at his perceived weakness. Kiso felt like a puppet, his strings pulled by 1,000 unseen hands, his every move dictated by the roar and the silence of the crowd. When they roared their approval, he lived. When they fell silent, or worse, when their cries turned to demands for death, his fate hung precariously in the balance, dependent on the whim of a single, powerful individual. He learned to play to them, in his own subtle way. Not with excessive theatrics, which felt alien to his nature, but with a display of stoic resilience, a refusal to show pain, an unwavering focus that the crowd interpreted as cold courage. He learned to make his kills clean and decisive when mercy was denied, to avoid prolonging the suffering in a way that might be seen as cruel or, conversely, hesitant. The silence was often worse than the roar. The moments when a defeated gladiator lay on the sand, his fate hanging in the balance, the entire amphitheater holding its breath, waiting for the judgment. In those silences, Kiso could feel the weight of tens of thousands of eyes, each one a tiny arbiter of life and death. He could feel the desperate hope of the fallen man, the cold calculation of the victor. It was a uniquely Roman form of psychological torture, played out on a grand scale. He also learned the bitter irony of their situation. The crowd adored them for their brutality, for their willingness to kill and die. They were heroes of the sand, their names chanted, their images perhaps even crudely scratched onto walls or amulets. Yet, off the sand, they were still slaves, property, men without rights, their lives circumscribed by the walls of the ludus and the whims of their lanista. The adulation was a fleeting, superficial thing, easily forgotten when the next spectacle began. Quintus's words often came back to him, they might respect it for a while. But they won't love you for it. And if they don't love you, they won't demand you be spared. Kiso understood now. It wasn't just about skill, it was about capturing the crowd's imagination, their fickle affections. He was living for their whim, dancing on the edge of a knife, his life measured in the decibels of their approval or condemnation. The roar was his lifeline, the silence, a terrifying precursor to judgment. And in that constant oscillation between the two, he felt his own humanity slowly, almost imperceptibly, eroding. Chapter 15, Victory's Bitter Taste, Defeat's Cold Embrace. The cycle of fight, survive, and prepare for the next ordeal became Kiso's new reality. Each victory brought a temporary reprieve, a brief surge of adrenaline-fueled relief, but it was always followed by a gnawing emptiness. The cheers of the crowd faded quickly, leaving behind the stark truth of his existence. He was a killer, his hands stained with the blood of men who, like him, were trapped in this brutal system. He watched as Felix, his Thraex companion, rose in popularity. The Nubian's powerful physique, his exotic appearance, and his explosive, aggressive fighting style made him a natural crowd favorite. He fought with a fierce pride, his griffin-crested helmet becoming a recognizable symbol. After one particularly spectacular victory, where Felix disarmed his opponent and then, with a theatrical flourish, granted him a warrior's death rather than waiting for the crowd's signal, a risky move that, thankfully, the presiding magistrate found amusing, he was showered with coins and flowers thrown from the stands. Back in the ludus, Felix was uncharacteristically subdued. He shared the meager coins with Kiso and Vibius, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep weariness. "They cheer because I kill well," he said quietly one evening, staring into the flickering light of an oil lamp. "They do not see the man. They see the animal I am forced to become." The strain was beginning to show on him. During one grueling match against a heavily armored Murmillo, Felix took a vicious blow to the leg. He stumbled, his small parmula offering little protection against the Murmillo's relentless assault. The crowd roared for the kill. Felix, his face contorted in pain but his eyes still blazing with defiance, managed to fight his way back, using his agility and the wicked curve of his sikha to wound his opponent and secure a hard-fought victory. But the leg injury was severe. The ludus medicus, Galenus, patched him up as best he could, but Felix now walked with a noticeable limp. His speed, his primary advantage as a Thraex, was compromised. Calvus, ever the pragmatist, began to look at Felix with a cooler, more appraising eye. A damaged asset was a less profitable one. Vibius, meanwhile, was treading a dangerous path. His victories as a retiarius were often narrow, dependent on luck, quick wits, and the occasional bit of theatrical showmanship that Crixus had drilled into him. He lacked the raw power of Felix or the disciplined precision of Kiso. To compensate, and perhaps to numb the constant fear, Vibius had taken to gambling, heavily. He'd wager his meager earnings, any small gifts from the crowd, even his rations, on the outcomes of other fights, on dice games in the barracks, on anything that offered a momentary thrill or the illusion of control. More often than not, he lost. Kiso would find him sullen and desperate, or worse, trying to curry favor with some of the more dangerous veteran gladiators to whom he owed debts. "Just a bit of bad luck, soldier boy," Vibius would say, forcing a grin. "My fortune's bound to turn." But Kiso saw the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled. The arena was not the only place Vibius was dicing with death. Regenhar, the German Murmillo, thrived in the brutality. He seemed to draw strength from the crowd's bloodlust. His victories were often savage, unnecessarily cruel. He would toy with wounded opponents, prolonging their agony to elicit louder cheers. After one fight where he disarmed a young, terrified recruit from a rival ludus, Regenhar spent several minutes mocking and taunting the boy before finally dispatching him with a brutal, almost contemptuous, blow. The crowd roared its approval. Calvus beamed. Kiso watched Regenhar's performance with a mixture of disgust and a chilling self-awareness. Was this what the arena demanded? Was this what he, too, would have to become to ensure his survival, to win the crowd's favor? The thought was a cold stone in his gut. He clung to his disciplined style, his clean kills when kills were necessary, but he felt the pressure, the unspoken expectation to deliver more spectacle, more savagery. The taste of his own victories grew increasingly bitter. Each life he took, each cheer he earned, felt like another step away from the man he had once been. The faces of his opponents haunted his sleep, not as enemies, but as fellow victims. He saw their fear, their desperation, their brief, extinguished hopes. Defeat, when it came to others, was a cold, stark embrace. He saw men he had trained with, men he had shared meager meals and whispered conversations with, cut down on the sand. He saw their bodies dragged away unceremoniously, their names already fading from memory. Sometimes, mercy was granted, a particularly brave display, a well-connected lanista, or simply the whim of the crowd or the presiding magistrate. But more often than not, the thumb pointed down. The constant proximity to death, the casual brutality, the ever-present fear, it began to take its toll on Kiso's soul. He found himself growing harder, more cynical. The easy camaraderie he had shared with Vibius and Felix in the early days became strained by the pressures of survival, by their diverging paths and coping mechanisms. He still valued their presence, their shared history, but a certain distance was growing. He found solace in small, solitary acts. He would meticulously clean his armor and weapons, not just for their preservation, but as a meditative ritual. He would watch the other gladiators train, analyzing their styles, their weaknesses, storing the information away. He tried to recall passages from the Stoic philosophers his father had sometimes quoted. Searching for some framework, some way to endure this existence with a shred of dignity. But the words of Seneca and Epictetus felt hollow in the face of the arena's savage reality. Victory brought survival, a temporary reprieve. But it came at a price. Each cheer was a nail in the coffin of his former self. Defeat was oblivion. There was no middle ground, no escape from the relentless cycle. He was trapped, a cog in a machine that fed on blood and spectacle. And with each fight, he felt a piece of his humanity chip away, lost in the roar of the crowd and the cold embrace of the sand. His soul was darkening, and he feared there was no way to stop it. Chapter 16, The Medicus, Mender of Men for the Next Slaughter. The Ludus Calvus, and indeed the arena itself, had its own grim ecosystem of support personnel, all dedicated to the singular purpose of keeping the gladiatorial machine running. Amongst these, none was more paradoxically vital than the medicus. Galenus, the Greek doctor assigned to Calvus's school, was a fixture in Kiso's increasingly brutal world, a cynical, world-weary presence who wielded his scalpels and sutures with the same detached efficiency that the gladiators wielded their swords. Galenus was a man of indeterminate middle age, his face etched with lines of fatigue and a profound disillusionment. He had once, Kiso learned through snippets of overheard conversation and Vibius's relentless information gathering, been a respected physician in Alexandria, perhaps even tending to scholars and nobles. How he had ended up in the blood-soaked environment of a Capuan ludus was a tale he never shared, but his eyes held the shadow of a fall from grace, a descent into a world he clearly despised yet was trapped within. His surgery, a small, grim chamber off the main training yard, reeked of stale blood, wine used as an antiseptic, and the herbal poultices he sometimes employed. It was a place of pain and, occasionally, of desperate hope. Here, gladiators were brought after brutal training sessions or, more significantly, after the savage encounters in the arena. Galenus's task was not truly to heal, not in the holistic sense. His job was to patch them up, to stem the bleeding, to set the broken bones, to make them functional enough to fight again. He was a mender of men, but only for the next slaughter. Kiso had become a frequent visitor to Galenus's domain. A deep gash from a Thracian sicca that required careful stitching. A dislocated shoulder, wrenched back into place with a brutal, agonizing maneuver. Bruised ribs, torn muscles, infected cuts, the litany of a gladiator's occupational hazards. Galenus worked with a detached professionalism. He rarely spoke unless necessary, his movements precise, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the often gruesome nature of his work. He would clean wounds with wine, probe them with slender instruments, and stitch them closed with a practiced hand, his face a mask of concentration. "Hold still, gladiator," he'd murmur, his voice dry as dust, as Kiso flinched from a particularly painful stitch. "The sooner this is done, the sooner you can go back to earning your master his denarii by trying to get yourself killed again." There was no sympathy in his tone, only a weary resignation. He had seen too much suffering, too many men patched up only to be returned to him in worse condition, or not returned at all. One afternoon, Kiso was in the surgery having a deep cut on his thigh cleaned and bandaged. He had sustained it in a particularly vicious fight against a retiarius whose trident had slipped past his shield. "This one was close, Vero," Galenus remarked, dabbing at the wound with a wine-soaked cloth. "A little deeper, a little higher, and you'd be bleeding out on the sand instead of gracing my humble establishment." "Luck was with me," Kiso said, gritting his teeth against the sting of the wine. Galenus snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "Luck. A fickle mistress for men in your profession. She'll embrace you one day and betray you the next." He began to bind the wound with clean linen. "The flesh wounds, these heal." He tapped Kiso's thigh. "Given time, and if the filth of the arena doesn't poison them. But the ones up here," he tapped his own temple with a blood-stained finger, "those never truly mend, do they?" Kiso met the medicus's gaze. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something beyond the cynicism, a glint of shared understanding, perhaps even a trace of a long-buried compassion. "You see it all, don't you, medicus?" Kiso asked quietly. "The before, the during, the after." Galenus finished tying the bandage and straightened up, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "I see men turned into meat. I see courage wasted, and brutality rewarded. I see a city that thirsts for blood and calls it entertainment." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his eyes held a profound sadness. "My job is to keep the meat fresh for as long as possible. A grim trade, but a trade nonetheless." He then turned his attention to a bubbling pot of herbs, his momentary lapse into introspection over. The mask of detachment was back in place. Galenus was not without skill. Kiso had seen him perform remarkable feats of battlefield surgery, albeit in a ludus setting. He had saved men from wounds that seemed undeniably fatal, his quick thinking and steady hand snatching them back from the brink. But always with the unspoken understanding that their reprieve was temporary. They were being saved not for themselves, but for Calvus, for the crowd, for the games. He was also a repository of grim knowledge. He knew the precise anatomy of a killing blow, the likely trajectory of a wound, the chances of survival from any given injury. Sometimes, veterans would consult him, not for treatment, but for an assessment of an opponent's past injuries, seeking any potential weakness to exploit. Galenus would provide the information dispassionately, another service in the business of death. The relationship between the gladiators and the medicus was a complex one. They depended on him for their physical survival, yet he was a constant reminder of their vulnerability, of the fragility of their bodies. He was a figure of respect, born of necessity, but also of fear. To be carried into Galenus's surgery after a fight was a sign of survival, but also a portent of future pain and renewed risk. Kiso often wondered about Galenus's own story, what horrors he had witnessed, what compromises he had made to end up in this place. Was he, too, a prisoner, albeit of a different kind? Was his cynicism a shield against the constant tide of suffering he was forced to confront? One day, Vibius was brought in, his arm hanging limp, his face pale with pain after a training accident where a clumsy secutor had brought a weighted practice shield down on his exposed shoulder. Galenus examined the injury, his touch surprisingly gentle. "A bad dislocation," Galenus announced. "And torn ligaments. You'll not be wielding a trident for many weeks, Retiarius." Vibius groaned, his usual bravado gone. "Weeks? But the games in Neapolis. Calvus was counting on me." Galenus looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Calvus will find another netman. He always does. You should worry about whether this arm will ever be strong enough to cast a net effectively again. Or if you'll be relegated to the Noxii pens if you can no longer fight." The casual brutality of his words was like a physical blow. Vibius fell silent, his eyes wide with a new, deeper fear. Galenus, the mender of men for the next slaughter. He was as much a part of the arena's grim machinery as the gladiators themselves, his skills perversely twisted to serve the endless cycle of violence. He offered no comfort, no false hope, only the cold, hard realities of their existence. And in his weary, cynical gaze, Kiso saw a reflection of the empire itself, efficient, brutal, and utterly indifferent to the human cost of its spectacles. Chapter 17, Life Between Battles, Small Mercies, Constant Dread. The periods between the Grand Munera were not times of rest, but of relentless preparation and simmering tension. Life in the Ludus Calvus settled into a grueling routine, a monotonous cycle punctuated by moments of fleeting camaraderie, petty cruelties, and the ever-present, gnawing dread of the next summons to the arena. Days began before dawn with the clang of the summons, followed by the meager, unchanging breakfast of barley gruel or stale bread. Then came the training yards. Even for seasoned gladiators like Kiso, who had now survived several encounters in the sand, the drills were unceasing. Pallas and Crixus worked them hard, refining techniques, pushing their endurance, introducing new tactics or pairings to keep them sharp and unpredictable. There was no room for complacency. A gladiator who grew lax was a gladiator marked for death. Kiso used these periods to observe, to learn, to hone his skills with a grim determination. He practiced his secutor footwork until his legs burned, his shield drills until his arm ached with a familiar fire. He sparred with other gladiators, not just those of his own ludus, but sometimes with fighters Calvus rented from other schools for cross-training purposes. Each encounter was a lesson, a chance to study different styles, different weaknesses. The small mercies were few and far between, but all the more precious for their rarity. Sometimes, after a particularly profitable set of games for Calvus, the lanista might authorize a slightly better evening meal, perhaps with a bit of stewed meat or some withered vegetables. Or an extra ration of watered-down wine might be distributed, leading to a brief, boisterous interlude in the barracks before exhaustion and the ever-present fear reasserted themselves. Vibius, his arms slowly healing under Galenus's grudging care, found ways to create his own small diversions. He was a natural storyteller, and in the evenings, he would sometimes entertain a small group with exaggerated tales of his past exploits or outlandish rumors he'd picked up from the guards or kitchen staff. His humor, though often dark, provided a brief respite from the grim reality of their lives. He also continued his gambling, though with less success and increasing desperation, often incurring the wrath of Regenhar or other veterans to whom he owed small debts. Felix, despite his leg injury, pushed himself relentlessly in training, determined to regain his former strength and agility. He spent hours practicing his Thraex movements, his face a mask of concentration, his pride unyielding. He and Kiso often trained together, pushing each other, offering critiques and encouragement in their own laconic ways. Their bond, forged in shared adversity, deepened, though it remained largely unspoken. For Kiso, one of the few solaces was reading. He had managed to acquire a few battered scrolls, a collection of Stoic philosophy, a history of the Punic Wars, bartered from a sympathetic kitchen slave in exchange for a small portion of his meager winnings. In the quiet hours of the night, when the barracks were finally still, he would painstakingly decipher the faded script by the light of a smuggled tallow dip. The words of Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus offered a fragile intellectual refuge, a reminder of a world beyond the blood and sand, a world where reason and virtue held sway. He tried to apply their teachings to his own horrific circumstances, to accept what he could not change, to maintain his inner composure, to find dignity even in degradation. It was an uphill battle, the harsh realities of the ludus constantly threatening to overwhelm the fragile philosophical edifice he tried to construct. The constant dread was a corrosive acid, eating away at their spirits. Every unfamiliar footstep in the corridor, every unexpected summons from a guard, sent a jolt of fear through them. Was it Calvus, come to inspect his property? Was it a doctor, with a new, brutal training regimen? Or was it the dreaded announcement of new games, a new list of names chosen for the arena? Nights were often the worst. The darkness seemed to amplify the fears, the regrets, the unspoken anxieties. Men would cry out in their sleep, plagued by nightmares. The silence would be broken by coughing fits, by the rustle of restless bodies, by the low murmur of whispered prayers or curses. Kiso often lay awake, staring into the oppressive blackness, the faces of the men he had killed replaying in his mind, the roar of the crowd a persistent echo. He wondered if he would ever truly sleep soundly again. The psychological grind was as relentless as the physical. The lack of privacy, the constant surveillance, the arbitrary cruelty of the guards, the ever-present threat of violence, it all wore them down. Some men succumbed to apathy, their eyes growing dull, their movements listless. Others became increasingly volatile, prone to sudden outbursts of rage over a perceived slight or a stolen scrap of food. Fights would erupt in the barracks, brutal, desperate affairs that were quickly and violently suppressed by the guards, often with indiscriminate use of the whip. Kiso learned to build walls around himself, to present an impassive exterior, to hoard his emotions. He knew that any display of weakness would be exploited. He focused on the present moment, on the next drill, the next meal, the next small task that required his attention. It was a way of coping, of maintaining a fragile grip on sanity in an insane world. Yet, even in this oppressive environment, flickers of humanity persisted. A shared glance of understanding between two men facing a particularly brutal drill. A quiet word of encouragement offered to a struggling recruit. A piece of bread secretly passed to someone who had lost their ration in a gamble. These small acts of kindness, of solidarity, were acts of defiance in a system designed to strip them of their compassion. Life between battles was a tightrope walk between endurance and despair. It was a constant struggle to maintain not just physical fitness, but mental fortitude. The small mercies offered brief footholds, moments of respite. But the dread was always there, a shadow lengthening as the next games inevitably approached, a reminder that their lives were not their own, but belonged to the whims of the crowd and the calculations of their master. It was a life lived on the edge of oblivion, where every sunrise brought both the possibility of survival and the threat of annihilation,